A hunter who knew these mountains better than the trails walked into the high country after a bear. He set his pack down neat against a tree, leaned his rifle beside it, and was never seen again. The search team that went up after him knew the Cohutta the way you know your own backyard. 37,000 acres of fog and laurel and folded ridges in the far north of Georgia. They had pulled the lost out of that wilderness for years, and none of it had ever made them afraid of the woods. Then the dog refused a trail he could smell. Then a deer stood watching them that was too tall, with eyes set too high and too forward, and turned its head far past the angle any deer should turn. Then, after dark, the dead hunter's voice began calling their names from the fog. This is the account of a man who broke every rule of his own training, who lost more than he can say on that mountain, and who came home carrying an injury that will never heal and a fear he has never been able to outrun. He still sees them at the edge of his field at dusk. He has almost convinced himself it is only his mind. Almost. Take a breath. We will get to all of that. But first, welcome back to the channel, and if this is your first night here, pull the blanket a little closer, because you picked a bad one to start on. Before we step into the fog, do 3 small things for me. Tap that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell, so the next time the woods go quiet, you are right here with me when it happens. Leave a like, because it is the one thing that helps these stories find the people who cannot sleep without them. And down in the comments, tell me one thing. Tell me where you are listening from tonight, and what the time is where you sit. I want to know how far this story is about to travel, and how many of you are out there in the dark with me right now. Because somewhere out there, in your part of the world, there are woods you do not walk into after dark. Maybe you already know the ones. Maybe, by the end of tonight, you will. So turn the lights down, put your headphones on, lock the door if it makes you feel better. It will not, but go ahead, and stay until the very end. Because the part I have never told anyone, the part I left out of every report, is waiting for you there. Let us begin. I can tell a buck from a doe at 200 yards. I have hunted and worked these mountains my whole life. So when I tell you that the thing standing at the edge of my search team that morning was not a deer, I need you to understand that I know exactly what a deer looks like. And that was the problem. I am going to lay it out plain, the way I would write an incident report, because order is the only thing that keeps it from coming apart in my hands. There are parts I left out of the real report. The man with the clipboard would have sent me for an evaluation, and I needed the work, and I needed the mountains, even after. Especially after. This is the version with the parts I left out. My name is Cole. I work backcountry patrol in the Cohutta Wilderness, in the far north of Georgia where the Blue Ridge starts to climb. If you have never been, the Cohutta is rough country. 37,000 acres of wilderness, no roads once you leave the gravel, ridge after ridge of hardwood and pine folded so tight that a man can stand on one and not see the next one for the fog. There are 2 rivers in the heart of it, the Jacks and the Canassaga, and the main trails cross them again and again dozens of times so that half of any patrol is spent wading cold water with your boots hung around your neck. The undergrowth is rhododendron and mountain laurel, and where it grows thick the old-timers call it a laurel hell, because once you are inside it you cannot see 10 feet and you cannot walk a straight line and you can pass within arm's reach of a man and never know he is there. I grew up 40 minutes from the trailhead. My grandfather logged these ridges before the wilderness was a wilderness, back when the railroad grades still had rails on them, and he taught me the woods before he taught me to read. When my life down in the city came apart, and I will not bore you with how, I came home. The Forest Service needed people who could move through that country alone for days and keep their heads. I could do that. For 9 years I did it well. I patrolled the trails, cleared blowdowns, checked the trail registers where hikers sign in, packed out the trash that day trippers leave at the river crossings, and when somebody did not come home, I was on the search team that went in after them. Search and rescue in the Cohutta is its own kind of hard. The terrain swallows people. A man steps off the trail to relieve himself, gets turned around in the laurel, and the fog comes down, and 3 days later we are dragging the river. Most of the time it ends sad and plain. A turned ankle, a cold night, hypothermia, sometimes worse. I had seen plenty of it, and none of it had ever made me afraid of the woods themselves. The woods were the one thing I trusted. The trailhead I worked out of had a little store at the gravel junction, the last building before the wilderness. It was run by a man named Earl Stamper. Earl was somewhere past 70, with a face like a dried apple and 2 fingers gone off his left hand from a sawmill years before I was born. He sold bait and gas and candy bars to hikers, and he whittled little animals out of basswood when business was slow, and he had lived at the edge of that wilderness his entire life. Earl did not talk much. When he did, you paid attention, because he never wasted it. He had buried a brother in those mountains, lost on a hunt when they were boys, never found, and the few times anyone got him to speak of the deep ridges, his voice changed and got careful. In October 2 years ago, a hunter went missing in the high country between the 2 rivers. His name was Glenn Marsh. He was 54, a local, a man who had hunted that wilderness since before he could drive. The kind who knew the ridges better than the trails. He had gone in alone after a bear, told his wife 3 nights, and on the 5th night she called the county. His truck was at the trailhead. That put it on us. We staged out of Earl's store at first light. The county sent a deputy. The Forest Service sent me and another ranger, and we called in a volunteer who ran a search dog, a man named Joel Faust. Joel was a wiry, quiet fellow from over the line in Tennessee, and he had a big shepherd named Ruger that had found more lost people than the rest of us put together. Joel did not care for small talk, and he did not care much for people, but he loved that dog, and he was the best tracker I ever worked beside, and his goal in life, as far as I could tell, was to never have to explain himself to anyone. I respected that. We laid the map on the hood of the truck and worked out our sectors. Glenn had told his wife he would hunt the saddle below a ridge the locals call Hawkville, a long bony spine of rock at the headwaters between the rivers, hard to reach, good for bear. Joel and I drew that sector together because it was the roughest and we were the 2 most able to take it. The deputy and the other ranger took the lower river ground. While we loaded packs, Earl came out onto the store porch. He stood there with a half-finished basswood fox in his good hand, and he watched us, and when I went up to buy water, he held me a second at the counter. "You drawing the Hawkbill?" he said. It was not a question. He had seen the map. I told him we were. He set the carving down. He looked at me with those old careful eyes. "Glenn know that country," he said. "Glenn do not get lost in that country. You understand what I am telling you?" I said I understood that something had happened to him then. An accident, a fall, a bear. Earl shook his head slow. "If your dog will not work the ridge," he said, "you do not make him. You come on out. You hear me, Cole? If the dog quits, you quit too." And then he picked his carving back up and went inside, and that was all he would say. And I stood there a moment with the cold water in my hand, feeling like a fool for the way the back of my neck had gone tight. I want to be honest. I did not think much of it at the time. Earl was an old man who had lost his brother in those mountains as a boy. And old grief makes its own weather, and I had a missing hunter, and a hard sector, and daylight burning. So Joel and I shouldered our packs, and Ruger pulled at his lead, eager and happy, and we crossed the first ford of the Jacks River with our boots around our necks and started up toward the Hawkbill. It took us most of the morning to reach the high ground. The trail gave out, and we were navigating by map and compass and the lay of the ridges, climbing through laurel so thick we had to crawl in places, the dog working ahead, casting back and forth for any scent. The fog sat in the hollows below us and burned off slow. It was a good, clear October day up high, the leaves turning, the air smelling of dry hardwood and the green, bitter smell of the rhododendron. We called Glenn's name as we climbed, and the sound went out flat over the folds of the mountains. We found his first sign around noon, a spent rifle cartridge on a game trail near the saddle, and not far from it, a small spray of dried blood on the leaves and the splayed running tracks of a deer driven hard. That made sense. Glenn had jumped a deer, taken a shot, maybe wounded it. We marked the spot, and Joel put Ruger on it, and the dog took the blood trail off the saddle and down into a draw, and we followed. The deer trail ran a long way. Too long. A gut-shot deer will run and then lie down and die, usually within a few hundred yards. This one had run for the better part of a mile, downhill and then up the far side, into a stretch of old growth where the laurel thinned out and the big hemlocks made a kind of green twilight even at midday. And there, at the head of the draw, Ruger stopped. He did not bark. He did not whine. He simply stopped, and his hackles came up all along his spine, and he backed up 2 steps and pressed against Joel's leg and would not go forward. Joel knelt by him and spoke to him low, the way you would gentle a horse, and tried to send him on. The dog would not go. He kept his eyes fixed on something up the draw, in the green dark under the hemlocks, and a low sound came out of him that I had never heard a dog make. Not a growl and not a whimper, but something underneath both of them. That is when I looked up the draw and saw the deer. It was standing in the hemlock shadow about 60 yards off, broadside, watching us. A whitetail, at first glance an ordinary big doe, and my mind put it in that box for one full second, the way the mind does, because that is what was supposed to be there. Then the second passed, and the box would not hold it. It was too tall. I have seen 10,000 deer, and I know the size of them in my bones, and this one stood a head taller at the shoulder than any deer has a right to, so that its back was level with my chest from 60 yards. Its legs were too long and the joints sat wrong, the back legs bending in a way that made my eyes want to slide off it, and it did not move the way a deer moves. A deer that sees you will flag its tail, or bolt, or freeze and then bound. This one only turned its head, slowly, far past the angle a deer turns its head, until it was looking back over its own spine, straight at me, with eyes that did not catch the light the way an animal's eyes catch the light. They were flat, dark, and they were too high in the skull and too forward, set the way a man's eyes are set, facing me. We stood there, the three of us, the man, the dog, and me, and that thing looked at us over its own back for what felt like a long time and was probably 10 seconds. Then it lowered its head, and it stepped behind a hemlock, and it was gone. No crash of brush, no bound. It simply was not there anymore. Joel had gone gray. He stood up with his hand in Ruger's fur, and he said, very quietly, that we should call this sector clear and go back down. And I almost did. I want you to know that. I almost listened. Before I take you up that ridge, where I should not have gone, I am going to ask you for one small thing. If you have not already, go ahead and like this video and subscribe to the channel. Consider it the smart move that the men in this story kept failing to make. They had every warning. They went anyway. You at least get to do the easy part right. I did not call the sector clear. Glen Marsh was still out there, and we had a fresh blood trail, and I told myself that what I had seen was a sick deer, a deformed deer, an animal with some wasting disease that had ruined the way it carried itself, and that there are stranger things in the woods than a deer that looks wrong. I told Joel we would follow the blood another half-mile, no farther, and turn back before the light went. He looked at me a long moment. Then he clipped Ruger onto a short lead close to his leg, and he did not let the dog range free again. That was the only argument he made, and I should have heard it for what it was. We pushed on up the draw, and the woods, which had been loud with our calling and the wind and the dry rattle of leaves, began, very slowly, to go quiet around us. The blood trail thinned and then quit at the top of the draw, on a long bench of ground below the spine of the hawkbill. We cast around for it and could not pick it up again. By then it was past 3 in the afternoon. The fog that had burned off the hollows that morning was coming back, sliding up out of the lower country and pooling along the bench, and the light under the hemlocks had gone the color of slate. We found Glen Marsh's pack on that bench. It was leaned upright against a tree, neat, the shoulder straps loose, as if a man had set it down to rest and meant to come right back. His rifle was leaned beside it, the action open, unloaded, which no hunter does in the field with light still in the sky. His hat sat on top of the pack. There was no sign of struggle, no blood, no drag marks, nothing torn, just a man's gear set down careful on a lonely bench at the top of a draw, 2 miles from the nearest trail, and the man himself gone, the same way the deer had gone, into the green dark without a sound. I called his name then, hard, over and over, and the fog ate it. Joel did not call. He was watching the dog. Ruger had his nose up, not down, scenting the air instead of the ground, turning slowly, and the low sound was back in his chest. Joel said the dog had a scent but would not follow it, and that he had worked that animal 6 years and never once seen him refuse a track he could smell. He said it the way a man states a fact he does not want to be true. We bagged what we could of Glen's gear for the report and marked the location, and I made the call that we would follow the bench a little way along the contour, looking for him, and be off the mountain by dark. The smart thing, the protocol, would have been to mark the find, get out, and bring a full team in at first light. I have gone over that decision more times than I can count. The truth is that I did not want to leave a man on that mountain overnight, even then, even afraid. That is the job. You do not leave them up there alone if there is any chance. The fog kept thickening. We moved along the bench, the two of us close together now, the dog tight on Joel's leg, and that was when I understood that something was keeping pace with us. It started as a sound on our left, downhill in the laurel below the bench, a single hoof fall on dry leaves. Then nothing. We stopped, and it stopped. We went on, and a moment later it came again, off to the left and a little behind, matching us. A deer that is curious will follow at a distance, but it follows clumsily, in fits, and it does not pace a man stride for stride along a contour through a laurel hell where a deer cannot easily go. This thing matched us. When we walked, it walked. When we stopped to listen, the woods went perfectly still, and the stillness had a weight to it, like the held breath of something that knew we were listening and was willing to wait us out. I told myself it was the wounded deer, circling, the way a hurt animal will. I told myself a lot of things on that bench. Once, through a gap in the laurel, I saw it, just for a second. It was down the slope, pacing us, and it was moving through brush too thick for a deer to move through that fast and that quiet. And it was holding its head low and level, the way a hunting dog holds its head on a scent, which is not a thing a deer does at all. Then the laurel closed and it was gone, and Joel had seen it too, and neither of us said a word about it, because saying it out loud would have made it real in a way that neither of us could carry just then. The light was failing fast under the fog. I admitted to myself that we were not going to make it off the mountain by dark, that the smart move now was to stop while we could still see, build a fire, and wait for morning. There was a small flat spot where the bench widened, with a rock outcrop at our backs that meant nothing could come at us from behind, and a few dead hemlocks for wood. We made camp there. I will tell you that putting a rock at my back and a fire in front of me was the first thing I had done all day that felt like sense. We got a good fire going as the dark came down. The fog turned the firelight into a small orange room with no walls. Ruger lay between us, not sleeping, his eyes open and tracking, his ears swiveling at sounds I could not hear. Joel sat with his hand on the dog the whole night. We did not talk much. There was nothing to say that did not sound insane, and we were both still trying hard to be sane men. The pacing started again after full dark, out beyond the firelight, circling. Hoof falls, slow and deliberate, all the way around our little camp and back. The same patient circuit, over and over, just past where the light reached. Each time it came around to the downhill side, it would stop and stand, and I would feel it out there in the fog, looking at the fire and at us, and then it would move on. Ruger tracked every step of it with his eyes and never made a sound louder than that low thing in his chest, as if he understood that to bark would be to answer, and that answering was the one thing you must not do. Sometime in the deep middle of the night, the circling stopped, and out of the fog, from the downhill dark, a voice spoke. It was Glenn Marsh's voice. I had heard it that morning on the dispatch recording his wife had given the county, a slow mountain drawl, a little hoarse. This was that voice, exactly, every bit of it. It came from down the slope, from the place the thing had been standing, and it said, low and tired, "Help me, I am down here, I am hurt, help me." Joel's hand went still in the dog's fur. Ruger had begun to shake, a fine deep tremble through his whole body, pressed flat to the ground between us. The voice came again. "Cole, I am down here, Cole." And it knew my name, which Glenn Marsh had never known, because I had never met the man, and we had spoken my name aloud all day on that bench, again and again, calling to each other in the laurel. I did not move. Joel did not move. I have done many hard things in those mountains, and the hardest by far was sitting at that fire with my hands flat on my own knees, and not answering a hurt man's voice calling my name from the dark, because the animal part of me, the old part, knew with total certainty that the thing in the fog was not hurt and was not Glenn, and was waiting to see if we were fool enough to walk out of the firelight toward the sound. It called 4 times, each time a little closer, each time more tired and more pitiful, working the voice like a tool it was learning to use better as it went. The 4th time it was close enough that I could hear, underneath the words, a wet clicking sound, like the working of a jaw that was not built right for speaking, and after that it did not try again. The rest of that night I cannot fully account for. We kept the fire up. The fog smelled, toward dawn, of something rank and musky and sweetish, a smell like a deer carcass left too long in the heat, and it rolled through camp in waves and then was gone. I prayed in my own poor way, and I am not a praying man. When the gray light finally came up and began to thin the fog, I had never wanted anything in my life the way I wanted to be down off that mountain and back at Earl Stamper's store with the gravel under my boots. In the first real light, Joel walked the edge of our camp to read the ground, and he called me over, and his face was the face of a man looking at something his mind will not file. In the soft dirt at the downhill edge of the firelight, where the thing had stood and spoken, there were tracks. They started as deer tracks, clean, sharp, the split heart shape of a whitetail coming up the slope toward our fire, and then in the space of 3 steps they changed. The 2 halves of the hoof spread apart and lengthened, and a 3rd and 4th point pressed in behind them, until the last prints near the firelight were not the track of any animal that has a name. They were long, and they had pressed deep, and the thing that made them had come up out of the fog and stood on 2 legs at the edge of our light and worn a dead man's voice, and then it had turned and walked back down into the laurel on 4, and the line of its going was straight as a fence row, the way nothing wild ever moves. We did not wait. We packed in the gray dawn with the fog still clinging to the bench, and we started down off the Hawkbill the fastest way the country would allow, which was straight down the spine toward the river, through the laurel hells, half climbing and half falling. Joel kept Ruger on the short lead. I kept the rifle in my hands. We did not call out. We had learned that much, and the thing came with us. It did not pace us slow and patient now, the way it had on the bench. The night was over, and the game it had been playing was over with it. And now it simply followed, openly, off to one side in the brush, keeping our pace as we hurried, and not bothering anymore to be quiet about it. I could hear it moving parallel to us through cover that no deer could cross at speed, and now and then through a gap I would catch it, a long gray shape going low and fast on the slope below, head down and level, gaining a little, falling back, hurting us, I understood later, keeping us on the line it wanted us on. The fog began to thin as we lost elevation, and that should have been a mercy and was not, because thinner fog meant I could see it better, and what I could see I have spent 2 years trying to unsee. Down a long open stretch of slope where the hemlocks made that green twilight, it came up out of the laurel and onto the line ahead of us, and for a few seconds it stood full in the open, blocking the way down, and there was light enough to see all of it at once. It stood on its hind legs. It was the height of a tall man and then some. The shape of it was the shape of a deer that something had tried to fold upright, the long neck, the narrow head, the high forward eyes, but the front legs had come down to its sides like arms and the joints all bent the wrong way, and the skin over it was patched and slack and rubbed bare in places like a deer in the last stage of a wasting disease, and the smell of it reached us across that open ground, that sweetish rot. It did not roar or charge. It simply stood in our path and turned that long head and looked at me with those flat, high eyes, and it opened its mouth, and out of it came, in Glenn Marsh's tired drawl, my own name. Cole. Patient. Almost gentle. What happened next happened in seconds, and I will tell it as straight as I can. Ruger broke. 6 years of training and the steadiest dog I ever knew, and the sight of that thing standing in our path snapped something in him, and he tore the lid clean out of Joel's hand and went up the slope at it, baying, a dog doing the one brave, terrible thing a dog will do. Joel screamed for him. The thing turned, fast, faster than its size should let it turn, and it came down off its hind legs onto all 4 as it moved, and it took the dog. I will not describe the way it took the dog. It was very fast, and the sounds did not last long, and then there were no sounds from Ruger at all. Joel went after his dog. That is the kind of man he was. He went up the slope toward the thing, and I caught the back of his pack and hauled him off his feet, and we both went down hard, and I dragged him down the slope by the straps while he fought me, the 2 of us falling more than running, the rifle gone out of my hand somewhere in it, and behind us I heard the thing come off whatever it was doing and start down after us. The slope gave way under us into a steep wash, and the wash dropped toward the river, and we went down it in a slide of wet leaves and rock with that thing coming behind, and I felt my leg catch between 2 rocks and turn, and something in my knee tore with a sound I felt more than heard, and the pain of it whited out the world for a second, and then we were at the bottom in the cold, shallow edge of the Jacks River with the fog low on the water. I do not fully know why it did not take us at the river. I have thought about it for 2 years. Maybe it would not cross the open running water. Maybe the daylight, full now, thin as it was enough. Maybe it had what it had come for, up the slope, with the dog and with Glenn Marsh before him, and we were never more than something to hurt. I dragged Joel and myself out into the middle of the ford, into the moving water to our waists, the cold of it a mercy on my ruined knee, and I turned with nothing in my hands and faced the bank. It stood at the edge of the trees above the river. On four legs now, head low and level, that long, wrong shape half in the laurel. It did not come down to the water. It watched us stand in the river, two broken men in the cold current, and the fog moved between us, and when it thinned again the thing was gone, the way it always went, without a sound and without a sign, as if the mountain had simply taken it back. We forded that river I do not know how many times getting out, me leaning on Joel, my knee swelling tight in the boot, Joel saying nothing at all, his hands empty, his dog dead on the mountain behind us. By the time we came out at the Gravel and Earl Stamper's store, it was past noon, and the deputy was there, and the other ranger, and they took one look at the two of us and stopped asking questions until later. We told them Glenn Marsh's gear was on the bench below the Hawkbill, and that we had found no sign of the man himself. We told them a bear had come into our camp in the night, that the dog had gone after it and been killed, that I had wrecked my knee in the fall coming down. A bear is a thing the world believes. They wrote it that way. A full team went up 2 days later and brought down Glenn's pack and rifle and hat from the bench, exactly where we had left them, and never found one trace of the man, not that fall and not the next spring, and the case is still open, filed as a missing person presumed dead in rough terrain, and that is the truth as far as any paper is concerned. Earl Stamper was on the porch when we came out of the woods. He did not say "I told you so." He looked at my knee, and he looked at Joel's empty hands and his empty face, and he looked up at the ridgeline where the fog still sat on the Hawkbill, and he said one thing, quiet, almost to himself. He said, "It wears them, the ones it takes, it learns them, and then it wears them." And then he went inside and brought Joel a cup of coffee with his own ruined hand, and that was the only kindness anybody knew how to offer. My knee never came all the way back. There is a brace I wear, and a limp I will have until I die, and on the cold mornings it aches, and the ache is a clock that keeps the time of that mountain. I cannot do backcountry patrol anymore. They moved me to a desk at the district office, permits and paperwork, and I took it, because I could not leave the mountains, and I could no longer walk into them, and a man has to be near the thing he loves even when it has hurt him. Joel Faust I have not seen since. He moved away that winter, and he never got another dog, and I do not blame him for any of it. He went up that slope after Ruger when most men would have run. I think about that. I think the difference between the two of us is that I was holding him back, and that if I had not been there he would have gone all the way up, and the mountain would have worn him too. Here is the part I did not put in any report, the part that keeps me up. I have white-tailed deer in the field behind my house. I always have. I used to love watching them at dusk, the does and their fawns coming out of the tree line to feed in the long light. I cannot watch them anymore, because every so often at the far edge of the field, in the last of the light, one of them will stop feeding and lift its head and turn it toward my window, slowly, farther than a deer turns its head, until it is looking back over its own spine, straight at me, with eyes set too high and too forward in the skull. And it will stand like that, watching the house, for a long time. And then I blink, or the light shifts, and it is only a deer again, an ordinary deer, flagging its tail and bounding off into the dark like deer do. I tell myself it is my mind. I tell myself the mountain broke something in me, and that this is the shape the breaking takes, a haunting I carry, not a thing that comes. I have almost convinced myself, but I keep the curtains drawn at dusk now, and I do not go out to the field after dark. And if you live in deer country in the southern mountains in the fog and you ever see one stop feeding and turn its head too far to look at you, do not go out for a closer look, and do not, whatever you do, answer it if it calls you by your name in a voice you know. Turn off the light, draw the curtain, and let it think you never saw a thing. The summer of 2008 marked a turning point in my life, one that continues to haunt my dreams 16 years later. I was 16, not 14, as I sometimes mistakenly recall when trying to distance myself from the memory. That summer, I stayed with my grandparents in rural Pennsylvania while my parents worked through what they called adult problems back home. It was there I met Isabel, a name I've changed to protect her privacy. We connected instantly, two outsiders in a small town where everyone else had known each other since birth. My grandfather, a stoic man with hands hardened by decades of manual labor, had lived in that area his entire life. His weathered face told stories before his mouth ever opened. One particularly humid evening, as fireflies danced outside and the distant rumble of thunder promised a storm that wouldn't deliver, Isabel and I asked him about local legends. "You looking for trouble?" he asked, eyes narrowing beneath bushy eyebrows. When we insisted we were just curious, he reluctantly spoke of an abandoned property about a kilometer south of their home. Property belonged to a man named Garrett Shaw, he said, his voice dropping to nearly a whisper, despite us being alone in the house. Came here from Ohio sometime around 1908. Built himself a fine house and a separate cabin where he'd disappear for days. Locals said he conducted experiments. Grandfather leaned forward, the wooden chair creaking beneath him. One winter, folks noticed no smoke coming from his chimney for weeks. When they finally checked, everything was intact. Food on the table, coat on the hook. But Shaw was gone, never found a trace of him. He warned us to stay away, saying the property had a history of bad luck for trespassers. My grandmother, overhearing from the kitchen, added her disapproval with a stern look that would normally have ended any foolish plans. But we were teenagers, convinced of our invincibility and skeptical of rural superstitions. To us, it sounded like the perfect adventure. That night, after my grandparents had gone to bed, Isabel and I whispered our plans through the open window between my grandfather's shed, where I slept, and the guest room where she stayed. The full moon cast long shadows across the yard, creating twisted shapes that seemed to reach toward us. "We should bring protection," Isabel suggested, her face half illuminated by moonlight. "Not because I believe in ghosts, but because abandoned buildings are dangerous." I agreed. In my grandfather's shed, I found 2 hunting knives with worn leather handles. From the kitchen, I quietly borrowed 2 flashlights and extra batteries. The wall clock in the hallway read 11:23 p.m. when we slipped out the back door, careful to let it close without making a sound. The night air felt dense, unusually cold for July. Stars peppered the cloudless sky, but they offered little comfort as we followed the dirt road leading away from the safety of my grandparents' home. Isabel walked close beside me, our shoulders occasionally brushing. Despite our brave talk, I could feel her tension. "Do you actually know where we're going?" she whispered, after we'd been walking for 15 minutes. "South," I replied with more confidence than I felt. Grandfather said it was about a kilometer south. We had no map, no GPS. Smartphones weren't yet ubiquitous, especially not in this reception-dead zone. All we had was a vague direction and the arrogance of youth. As the dirt road gave way to an overgrown path, I clicked on my flashlight, the beam cutting weakly through the darkness ahead. The forest seemed to close in around us, the spaces between trees narrowing. Several times I thought I heard footsteps behind us, only to turn and find nothing but shadows. Isabel must have felt it too, the sensation of being watched, because she moved even closer, her fingers gripping my arm. "Maybe this wasn't such a good idea," she murmured, but neither of us suggested turning back. After what felt like hours but was likely only 40 minutes, we spotted it, a dark silhouette rising from the forest floor. The house stood 2 stories tall, its Victorian architecture a stark contrast to the simple rural buildings we were accustomed to seeing. Windows like empty eye sockets stared back at us, and the wraparound porch sagged in the middle as if exhausted from decades of abandonment. We stood at the edge of the clearing, suddenly hesitant. The house seemed to be waiting for us, patient after all these years. "We came all this way," I said, though it sounded like I was trying to convince myself. Isabel nodded and we approached, stepping carefully over the threshold of the property. Immediately, the temperature seemed to drop several degrees. I told myself it was just the natural coolness of a clearing at night, but the suddenness of the change left me unsettled. The front door hung partially open, swollen wood preventing it from closing properly. It groaned in protest as I pushed it wider, revealing a foyer with peeling wallpaper and a thick layer of dust covering everything except, and this detail still disturbs me, a set of footprints that led from the door to the staircase and back. "Someone's been here recently," Isabel whispered, pointing her flashlight at the tracks. "Probably other teenagers," I replied, though the footprints looked too large, too deliberate to belong to thrill-seeking kids. We moved through the first floor, our flashlights revealing a home frozen in time. In the parlor, furniture remained arranged as if awaiting guests. A moth-eaten sofa, two armchairs facing each other across a low table. On the walls hung paintings of landscapes I didn't recognize, the colors darkened with age. One painting particularly caught my attention. A forest scene at twilight, with a small, indistinct figure standing among the trees, facing away from the viewer. The kitchen still contained dishes in the cabinets, some broken, others remarkably intact. A cast-iron pot sat on the cold stove, empty but clean, as if waiting to be used again. Most disturbing was the dining room, where places were set for dinner. 3 settings, though Garrett Shaw reportedly lived alone. The table was bare, except for those place settings, and a single book lying open in the center, its pages yellow with age. I approached cautiously and directed my flashlight at the text. The book contained diagrams and dense text in what appeared to be Latin. Isabel, who had taken a year of Latin in school, tried to translate. Something about doors, passages. She shook her head. My Latin isn't good enough. Throughout the house, in nearly every room, we found dolls. Not children's toys, but crude, handmade figures fashioned from twigs, cloth, and what looked disturbingly like human hair. They sat on windowsills, bookshelves, and furniture, their button eyes reflecting our flashlight beams. "Who makes dolls like this?" Isabel whispered, refusing to touch them. The second floor contained bedrooms, 3 of them, again at odds with the story of a man living alone. The master bedroom appeared undisturbed, bed neatly made, clothes still hanging in the wardrobe. The other 2 rooms were empty except for bare mattresses and more of those unsettling dolls. In what must have been Shaw's study, we found bookshelves lined with texts on obscure subjects, ancient rituals, forgotten languages, and what appeared to be personal journals. I opened one, dated 1912, and read a passage. "The barrier thins near the cabin. I can hear them now, even from the house. They speak to me through the walls between worlds, not much longer now." I closed the journal, suddenly eager to leave the house. The walls seemed to press inward, the air thick and stale, making it difficult to breathe. "Let's check the cabin," I suggested, not because I wanted to, but because it felt like the next logical step in our ill-conceived adventure. The cabin stood approximately 50 yards from the main house, a simple wooden structure with a single window visible from our position. Unlike the house, which merely looked abandoned, the cabin projected an aura of wrongness that's difficult to articulate. The surrounding vegetation had grown wild everywhere, except in a perfect circle around the cabin, as if nature itself refused to approach. As we made our way across the clearing, my flashlight began to flicker despite the fresh batteries. Isabel's did the same, the beams weakening with each step toward the cabin. "I don't like this," she said, stopping about halfway there. I was about to agree when I heard it, a voice, barely audible, coming from somewhere to our right. "Over here." The words weren't shouted but somehow cut through the night air with perfect clarity. I stopped immediately, swinging my flashlight toward the source. "Did you hear that?" I asked Isabel, who looked at me with confusion. "Hear what?" I directed my failing flashlight toward a small mound of what appeared to be cement about 10 feet off our path. Something about it demanded my attention. Despite Isabel calling my name, I felt compelled to investigate. The mound was roughly oval-shaped, about 3 feet long and 2 feet wide, with a smooth surface unlike the crude cement work I'd expect in an abandoned property. As I drew closer, I noticed faint markings etched into its surface, symbols similar to those in the book we'd seen in the house. I reached out, fingers hovering inches above the strange object. A terrible coldness radiated from it, not physical cold, but something that seemed to reach past my skin and into my very thoughts. "Don't touch it," Isabel called, but her voice sounded distant, muffled, as if coming from underwater. My hand descended anyway, drawn by an irresistible urge. The moment my fingertips contacted the surface, the world around me vanished. Consciousness returned slowly, like struggling through layers of thick mud. I became aware of damp earth beneath me, the smell of rotting leaves, and complete darkness. My flashlight lay several feet away, its beam reduced to a faint glow that illuminated nothing. I sat up, head pounding with a migraine-like intensity. How long had I been unconscious? Minutes? Hours? The night sky offered no clues, clouds now obscuring the moon and stars. "Isabel?" I called, voice cracking. No response. Panic surged through me as I scrambled to my feet, retrieving my nearly useless flashlight. I swept the dim beam around, desperately searching for her. About 20 feet away, near the cabin's entrance, I spotted a shape on the ground. I ran, stumbling over unseen obstacles, until I reached her. Isabel lay face down in the dirt, unmoving. When I gently turned her over, her skin felt ice cold despite the summer night. "Isabel, wake up!" I shook her shoulders, fear tightening my throat. Her eyes snapped open, unfocused and dilated. For a moment she stared through me rather than at me. Then a scream tore from her throat, raw, primal, filled with terror. "Leave us alone!" she shrieked, pushing away from me with surprising strength. I fell backward, confused and frightened. "It's me. What's wrong?" Her breathing came in rapid gasps as she pressed herself against the cabin wall. "He's been following us since we entered the forest, standing just at the edge of the light, watching." "Who?" "There's nobody. You didn't see him?" Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Tall. So tall. No face." I looked around us, seeing nothing but shadows. "There's no one here, Isabel. You must have had a nightmare." But even as I said it, I felt that same sensation from earlier, of being observed by unseen eyes. The darkness between the trees seemed denser, more purposeful. Isabel's condition alarmed me. Her face had a gray pallor, and a thin trickle of blood ran from her nose. When she tried to stand, her legs buckled beneath her. "We need to leave. Now." I helped her up, supporting most of her weight as we turned away from the cabin. As we began our retreat, I made the mistake of looking back. Just for an instant, in the weak beam of my flashlight, I thought I saw a figure standing in the cabin doorway, impossibly tall and thin, motionless. I blinked, and it was gone. "God help us," I whispered, no longer concerned with appearing brave. The journey back through the forest became a nightmare of disorientation and fear. Without clear landmarks, and with our flashlights failing, we repeatedly found ourselves walking in circles. Trees that should have been familiar looked alien. Paths that should have led us home looped back toward the property we were trying to escape. Isabel's condition deteriorated with each passing minute. Her skin remained cold to the touch, her breathing shallow. She kept looking over her shoulder, flinching at sounds I couldn't hear. Once, she stopped suddenly, staring into the darkness behind us. "He's still following," she murmured. "He wants us to go back." I tightened my grip on her arm and pressed forward, choosing directions based on instinct rather than knowledge. Every shadow concealed potential threats. Every snapping twig signaled pursuit. The forest, which had seemed merely unwelcoming before, now felt actively hostile. After what seemed like hours of panicked wandering, we stumbled upon the dirt road. Relief flooded through me at this sign of civilization, however modest. Isabel had become too weak to walk on her own, so I hoisted her onto my back, her arms draped limply over my shoulders. The road led us back toward my grandparents' house, each step a small victory against the darkness behind us. Isabel's weight grew heavier as my strength waned, but the thought of stopping, of being caught by whatever she believed pursued us, kept me moving. When we finally reached the edge of my grandparents' property, I checked my watch, expecting to see that hours had passed. The digital display read 11:39 p.m. We had left at 11:38 p.m. 1 minute had elapsed during what felt like hours of exploration and terror. I stood frozen, trying to process this impossibility. Had my watch malfunctioned? Had we somehow experienced a shared delusion? Neither explanation satisfied the primal part of my brain that recognized we had encountered something beyond normal understanding. I called my uncle from my grandfather's landline, fabricating a story about Isabel falling and hitting her head while we were taking a night walk. He arrived within minutes, his expression shifting from annoyance to concern when he saw her condition. In the harsh interior light of his pickup truck, Isabel looked worse than she had in the forest. Her skin had a waxy quality, eyes sunken and unfocused. The trickle of blood from her nose had dried, leaving a dark streak against her pale skin. "What really happened?" my uncle demanded as we sped toward the county hospital 20 miles away. I hesitated, then told him everything. Grandfather's story, our midnight expedition, the house with its strange contents, the cement mound, our blackouts, and the impossible time discrepancy. His knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. "You stupid, stupid kids," he said, voice trembling with anger and what I now recognize as fear. "That place has a history. People go missing. Others come back. Changed." At the hospital, doctors diagnosed Isabel with a severe concussion, though they seemed puzzled by some of her symptoms. While they examined her, my uncle pulled me aside in the sterile hallway. "Listen carefully," he said, keeping his voice low. In 1962, 4 high school students went to that property on a dare. Only 3 returned. In 1978, a research team from the state university spent a night there. They all came back but reported equipment failures and missing time. One researcher developed seizures that continued until his death 3 years later. In 1993, a family moved into that house despite warnings. They fled after 3 days, the mother babbling about voices in the walls and something in the cabin. They never returned for their belongings. He gripped my shoulders. "Whatever's in that place, it's not natural. You and your friend are lucky to be alive." Isabel remained in the hospital for 3 days. The physical wound on her head, a deep gash that neither of us remembered her receiving, required 12 stitches. But the psychological effects lingered much longer. She experienced nightmares, insomnia, and a persistent feeling of being watched. Sometimes in mid-conversation, she would stop and stare at something over my shoulder, though nothing was there when I turned to look. The most disturbing development appeared 2 weeks after our experience. A scar formed around the healed wound on her head, not the typical straight line of a surgical scar, but an intricate pattern resembling the symbols we had seen in Shaw's book and on the cement mound. When doctors examined it, they had no explanation. One elderly nurse crossed herself and refused to touch it. That was 16 years ago. I've since moved away from Pennsylvania, built a life, and tried to forget what happened that night. For years, I convinced myself we had encountered nothing more than an abandoned property and the power of suggestion combined with teenage imagination. But certain facts remain unexplainable. The missing time, the mysterious wound on Isabel's head, the symbolic scar that followed. And most troubling, the recurrent dreams that have plagued me since that night. Dreams of standing in front of the cabin, hearing a voice invite me inside, and knowing that something waits there, patient and ancient. 3 years after our experience, driven by questions that wouldn't subside, I researched Garrett Shaw. County records confirmed he existed and disappeared in 1916, not the 1908 my grandfather had mentioned. More interesting were newspaper clippings describing Shaw as a scientist of unorthodox methods who had studied with renowned physicists before retreating to rural Pennsylvania. One article mentioned his obsession with thinning the veil between realities, language eerily similar to what I'd read in his journal. Most disturbing was a photograph accompanying the article. Shaw standing in front of his house, tall and gaunt, his eyes deeply shadowed. Behind him, barely visible in the cabin window, was a blurred figure that the caption did not mention. I've never returned to that property, though sometimes I dream of it with such vivid detail that I wake believing I've been there again. In these dreams, I always approach the cabin, always hear the voice calling me, always feel the pull towards something waiting inside. Isabel and I lost touch after that summer. Last I heard, she had moved to Arizona, as far from Pennsylvania forests as possible. I wonder if she still feels watched, if she still sees movement at the corner of her vision, if the scar still forms perfect, impossible symbols on her skin. Sometimes, on particularly dark nights, I find myself staring into the shadows of my bedroom, remembering the sensation of unseen eyes. I wonder what would have happened if we had entered the cabin. I wonder what Garrett Shaw found behind the thinning veil. Most of all, I wonder if part of us never left that forest, if something of our essence remains there, trapped in that single minute that contained hours of experience. The rational part of my mind dismisses these thoughts as the lingering trauma of a frightening teenage experience. But another part, the part that feels the weight of unseen observation in empty rooms, knows that some questions are better left unanswered, some doors better left unopened. Whatever waits in that cabin is still waiting and always will be. This happened back in September of 2003. I was 16 years old and just starting my junior year when my father announced we'd be taking a family fishing trip to northern Quebec. Dad worked in the textile import business and had developed a friendship with a supplier in Montreal named Bernard Rousseau. They'd been corresponding for months about this expedition, planning to strengthen their business relationship over a shared love of fishing in the remote wilderness. Bernard was bringing his 17-year-old son, so Dad decided to bring me and my older sister Camille. We were 18 months apart and had always been inseparable. Our parents often called us the dynamic duo, because of our tendency to find trouble wherever we went. Mom thought the wilderness would be the perfect place to keep us out of mischief. The drive from our home in White Plains took 2 full days. We stayed overnight in a roadside motel just outside Montreal, where Dad reviewed maps with an intensity that made me nervous. These weren't ordinary road maps. They were topographical surveys covered in elevation lines and symbols I didn't recognize. The area we were heading to had more white space than marked features. "How far north are we going exactly?" Camille asked, peering over Dad's shoulder at the maze of blue lines representing waterways. "Far enough that cell phones won't work," Dad replied with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "That's the whole point. Complete disconnection from civilization." The next morning, we met Bernard at a Tim Hortons near the highway. He was a thick-set man with calloused hands and eyes that seemed permanently squinted from years of reading in poor light. His son Pascal appeared to be the stereotypical awkward teenager, all elbows and acne, with thick glasses that he constantly adjusted. He barely made eye contact when we were introduced. As we drove north in convoy, the landscape began to change dramatically. The suburban sprawl of Montreal gave way to farmland, then smaller towns, then forests that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. The highways became smaller roads, then gravel tracks that wound through terrain that looked increasingly untouched by human development. We stopped for lunch at a small diner where the waitress spoke rapid French and looked at us with barely concealed suspicion. Dad handled the conversation while Camille and I struggled with our high school French. The woman's expression softened slightly when she realized we were making an effort, but her smile never reached her eyes. She asked if we knew how dangerous the woods can be this time of year. Dad translated after she walked away. "Apparently, there have been some incidents with wildlife lately." "What kind of incidents?" I asked, but Dad just shrugged and returned to his coffee. After lunch, we left the main road entirely. The track we followed was barely wide enough for 2 vehicles, carved through dense forest that pressed in on both sides. Occasionally, we'd pass massive logging trucks loaded with tree trunks so large they defied comprehension. The drivers never waved or acknowledged our presence. They just thundered past, leaving clouds of dust and diesel fumes in their wake. "Look at the size of those trees," Camille whispered, pressing her face to the window. "Some of them must be hundreds of years old." She was right. The forest we were passing through felt ancient, primordial. The trees were so tall their tops disappeared into shadow, and the understory was so thick it appeared impenetrable. There were no hiking trails, no signs of human recreation, just endless wilderness that seemed to swallow the road ahead of us. As we drove deeper into this green maze, I began to feel a strange sense of unease. It wasn't just the isolation, though that was certainly part of it. There was something about the quality of the light filtering through the canopy, something about the way shadows seemed to move when they should have been still, that made the hair on my arm stand up. "How much further?" I asked Dad, trying to keep my voice casual. He consulted his map again. "According to Bernard, we should reach the outfitter station within the hour. From there, it's a boat ride to the island." Island. That was the first time anyone had mentioned we'd be staying on an island. Somehow, I'd imagined a lakeside cabin, maybe with hiking trails and other campers nearby. The reality was beginning to sound much more isolated than I'd prepared for. The outfitter's station, when we finally reached it, was little more than a weathered wooden building with a dock extending into a lake so large I couldn't see the opposite shore. The proprietor, a grizzled man named Dennis, spoke broken English and seemed surprised to see us. "You sure you want island?" he asked Dad repeatedly as we loaded our supplies into his boat. "Is very, how you say, alone out there. No other people for many kilometers." Dad assured him that isolation was exactly what we were looking for. As we putted away from the dock, I caught a glimpse of Dennis shaking his head and making the sign of the cross. The boat ride took nearly an hour, winding through a maze of channels and bays that all looked identical to my untrained eye. The water was so dark it appeared black, reflecting the overcast sky like a mirror. Occasionally, we'd pass other islands, some with cabins, most completely wild. But as we traveled further from the outfitter's station, even these signs of civilization disappeared. The silence was oppressive. Our boat's motor was the only sound for miles, and when Dennis occasionally cut the engine to check his bearings, the quiet that descended felt almost supernatural. No birds sang, no insects buzzed. Even the water lapped against our hull with a muffled quality that seemed to absorb sound rather than produce it. "Where are all the animals?" Camille asked, voicing what we were all thinking. Bernard said something to Dennis in rapid French. The old man's face grew serious as he responded, gesturing toward the shoreline with obvious agitation. "What did he say?" I pressed. "He says the animals have been different lately," Bernard translated reluctantly. "Moving in unusual patterns. Some species have disappeared entirely from areas where they were once common." "Disappeared how?" Dad asked, his business instincts picking up on something evasive in Bernard's tone. "He's not sure. Dennis has been guiding in these waters for 30 years, and he says he's never seen anything like it." Before anyone could ask more questions, our destination came into view. The island was smaller than I'd imagined, perhaps 50 yards across at its widest point, with a single cabin situated near the center. A small dock extended from the eastern shore, with 2 aluminum rowboats tied alongside it. There was a woodpile, an outhouse, and not much else. The closest land was at least 200 yards away across dark water. As we approached the dock, I noticed something that made my stomach clench. The shoreline we were approaching was completely clear, just rocky beach and a few scattered boulders. But the mainland shore visible across the water was a wall of forest so dense it appeared solid, like a green-black curtain that started at the water's edge and extended upward beyond sight. Dennis helped us unload our supplies with efficient movements, but I could see he was eager to leave. He declined Dad's invitation to stay for coffee, muttering something about wanting to reach the outfitter's station before dark. As his boat disappeared into the maze of channels, the sound of its motor fading to nothing, the weight of our isolation settled over us like a physical thing. The cabin itself was more comfortable than I'd expected. 2 sets of bunk beds, a wood stove, a small kitchen area with a propane refrigerator, and windows that looked out over the water in 3 directions. Someone had carved dozens of names and dates into the wooden walls, previous visitors leaving evidence of their passage. Most of the dates were recent, within the last decade, but some went back to the 1970s. "Look at this," Camille called from near the window facing the mainland. She was pointing to a carving that read, "Help Us, 1987, in letters that had been scratched deep into the wood with obvious desperation. "Probably just kids fooling around," Dad said, but his voice lacked conviction. Pascal, who had been quiet during the entire journey, spoke up for the first time. "My father and I came here last spring," he said in heavily accented English. "The fishing was strange then, too. The fish we caught had scars, deep scars, like something had tried to eat them but let them go." Bernard shot his son a sharp look. "Pascal exaggerates," he said quickly. "Boys his age have active imaginations." But Pascal continued, ignoring his father's obvious displeasure. "And the sounds at night? You'll hear them soon enough. They don't sound like any animal I know." "That's enough," Bernard snapped, and Pascal fell silent. But not before I caught the fear in his eyes. We spent the rest of the afternoon settling in and preparing dinner. The men organized tackle boxes and discussed fishing strategies for the morning, while Camille and I explored the island's perimeter. It didn't take long. We could walk the entire shoreline in under 10 minutes. The island's interior was mostly flat, covered with scraggly grass and a few stunted pine trees that seemed to struggle in the shallow soil. But it was the view of the mainland that dominated everything. From every vantage point, we looked across dark water at an unbroken wall of forest that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. "There's something wrong with those woods," Camille said quietly as we stood at the island's northwestern point. "Look how dark they are, even though it's still daylight." She was right. While the sky above us was merely overcast, the forest across the water appeared to exist in perpetual twilight. The trees were so densely packed that no light seemed to penetrate more than a few feet into their depths. And look at the tree line, I added, pointing to where the forest met the water. There's no beach, no transition zone. It's like the trees are growing right out of the water. As if responding to our scrutiny, a sound echoed across the lake from those dark woods, a low, resonant call that seemed to come from deep within the forest. It wasn't quite a howl, wasn't quite a groan, but something in between that made every muscle in my body tense. What was that? Camille whispered. Before I could answer, the sound came again, closer this time, and unmistakably answered by something else deeper in the woods. The calls seemed to move through the forest in a pattern, as if multiple creatures were communicating across vast distances. We hurried back to the cabin as shadows began to lengthen across the water. I woke before dawn to the sound of my father moving around the cabin, quietly preparing coffee and breakfast. The wood stove had burned down to coals during the night, and the cabin was cold enough that I could see my breath. Through the window, the lake surface was perfectly still, covered with a thin layer of mist that made the mainland shore barely visible. "Morning, sunshine," Dad whispered when he saw me stirring. "Want to help me get the fire going again?" I nodded and slipped out of my sleeping bag, careful not to wake Camille. As I fed kindling to the coals, Dad began preparing breakfast, bacon, toast, and coffee strong enough to wake the dead. I had never been much of an early riser, but there was something about the complete silence outside that made sleep seem impossible anyway. "Sleep well?" Dad asked, though something in his tone suggested he hadn't. "Did you hear those sounds last night?" I asked quietly. "After we went to bed?" Dad paused in his coffee preparation. "What kind of sounds?" "Like calling. From across the water. It went on for hours." He was quiet for a long moment. "Old forests make strange noises," he said finally. "Trees settling, branches rubbing together in the wind. Sounds carry differently over water, too. They can seem closer than they really are." But I had been listening to those sounds for hours, and they definitely weren't trees settling. They had rhythm, pattern, almost like a language, and they had moved through the forest in ways that suggested intelligence behind them. Bernard and Pascal were already awake and organizing their fishing gear when Camille finally emerged from her sleeping bag. She looked as tired as I felt, with dark circles under her eyes and a distracted expression. "Bad dreams?" I asked her quietly while the men discussed their fishing strategy. "Weird dreams," she corrected. "I kept dreaming I was swimming across the lake to the mainland. In the dream, I could see things moving in the forest, watching me. But I couldn't stop swimming toward them." A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the cold morning air. I had experienced something similar. Not exactly dreams, but a strange pulling sensation, as if something across the water was calling to me specifically. After breakfast, we loaded into the 2 aluminum rowboats. Dad and Bernard took one boat, while Pascal rowed Camille and me in the other. The plan was to fish the deeper waters near the center of the lake, where Bernard claimed the largest pike and walleye could be found. The mist was beginning to lift as we rowed away from the island, revealing more of the lake's vast expanse. In daylight, I could see that we were in the center of what must have been a massive body of water, surrounded on all sides by unbroken forest. There were no other islands visible, no cabins or docks, no signs that humans had ever visited this place before us. "How big is this lake?" I asked Pascal as he rowed with steady practice strokes. "No one knows exactly," he replied. "The maps show it connected to other lakes, but the connections are through swamps and channels that change with the water level. Some say it's part of a system that stretches for hundreds of kilometers." As we rowed further from the island, I began to notice something disturbing about the water itself. While the surface appeared normal, occasionally I could see dark shapes moving beneath us, shadows that seemed too large and moved too purposefully to be fish. When I pointed this out to Pascal, he nodded grimly. "The water is very deep here," he said. "Denis told my father it's over 100 meters in some places. No one has ever mapped the bottom." We reached our fishing spot and dropped anchor near a submerged rock formation that Bernard claimed was a favorite feeding area for large fish. The men immediately began setting up their elaborate fishing rigs, while Camille and I watched with mild interest. I had never been particularly enthusiastic about fishing, and this trip was proving no exception. The waiting was boring, the boat was uncomfortable, And there was something about being suspended over such deep, dark water that made me profoundly uneasy. Every few minutes I found myself scanning the mainland shore, looking for... what? I wasn't sure. There, Camille said suddenly, pointing toward the eastern shore. Did you see that? I followed her gaze but saw only the wall of forest that surrounded the lake. See what? Something moved, something big, just inside the tree line. Pascal looked up from his fishing rod with obvious alarm. Where? Right there, near that dead tree that's leaning over the water. It was tall, maybe 7 or 8 feet, and it was watching us. We all stared at the spot she indicated, but the forest remained still. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that she was right, that something was indeed watching us from the dark spaces between the trees. Probably just a moose, Dad called from the other boat, though he was scanning the shoreline as intently as the rest of us. Do moose stand upright on their hind legs? Camille asked, and the question hung in the air unanswered. The fishing, when we finally focused on it, was unlike anything I had experienced before. The fish we caught were large and aggressive, but they also bore strange markings, scars, and discolorations that Pascal had mentioned the day before. My first catch was a northern pike, nearly 3 feet long, but across its flanks were 3 parallel gouges that looked like claw marks from something much larger than any fish. What could have done this? I asked, holding up the scarred pike. Bernard examined the fish with a troubled expression. Bears sometimes fish these waters, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Or maybe large birds of prey. But the markings were too precise, too deep, and too numerous to be from random predator encounters. Nearly every fish we caught showed similar damage, some old and healed, others fresh enough that they were still bleeding. By midday, we had caught enough fish for several meals, but the strange condition of our catch had cast a shadow over what should have been a successful morning. As we rowed back toward the island for lunch, I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder at the mainland shore, unable to shake the feeling that we were being observed. I don't want to come out again this afternoon, I announced as we tied up at the dock. Dad looked surprised. You caught the biggest fish of the morning. I thought you were starting to enjoy it. It's not the fishing, I said, struggling to articulate my growing unease. It's everything else. Something feels wrong out here. Camille nodded in agreement. I want to stay on the island too. We can keep the fire going and start preparing dinner. Dad seemed disappointed, but didn't argue. Perhaps he had noticed our growing tension and decided not to force the issue. After lunch, the men and Pascal rowed out for an afternoon of fishing, leaving Camille and me alone on the island for the first time. That's when things began to get truly frightening. The afternoon sun should have made everything feel safer, more normal. Instead, as I watched the 2 boats disappear into the maze of bays and channels, the isolation pressed down on me like a weight. The island, which had seemed merely small before, now felt absurdly vulnerable. A tiny dot of land surrounded by vast expanses of dark water and hostile wilderness. Camille and I busied ourselves around the cabin, organizing supplies and feeding the wood stove, but our conversation kept trailing off into uncomfortable silences. Every few minutes, one of us would glance toward the mainland shore as if expecting to see something that shouldn't be there. I keep thinking about Pascal's story, Camille said, as she arranged canned goods in the small pantry. About the sounds at night. Do you think he was trying to scare us? Did he seem like the type to make up stories? I asked. He barely said 10 words the whole trip until yesterday. She considered this. No, he seemed genuinely frightened, and his father was obviously angry that he brought it up. Why would Bernard want to hide something like that? Maybe because he needs Dad's business. If there's really something dangerous up here, and Dad found out about it. She didn't finish the thought, but she didn't need to. Our family wasn't wealthy, but Dad's textile business was successful enough that losing a major supplier would hurt Bernard financially. I was contemplating this uncomfortable possibility when movement caught my eye. I was standing near the window that faced east toward the mainland, and for just a moment, I thought I saw something large shift among the trees near the water's edge. Camille, I called quietly. Come look at this. She joined me at the window, and we both stared intently at the spot where I thought I'd seen movement. The forest appeared still, But there was something about the shadows between the trees that seemed different, deeper somehow, as if they were concealing something substantial. "I don't see anything," Camille said, but her voice was tense. "Just keep watching that area, near the fallen log that's half in the water." We stood there for several minutes, scanning the tree line with growing unease. The forest was so dense that even in broad daylight, it was impossible to see more than a few feet into its depths. Anything could be hiding in there, watching us, and we would never know. Then it moved. At first, it was just a shift in the pattern of shadows, so subtle I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. But then it moved again, and this time there was no mistaking it for a trick of light. Something tall and dark was standing among the trees, partially concealed, but definitely present. "There," I whispered, pointing. "Do you see it now?" Camille's intake of breath told me she did. "Oh God," she whispered. "What is that?" The figure, for lack of a better word, was roughly humanoid in shape but wrong in proportions. It stood at least 7 feet tall, with elongated limbs and what appeared to be an oversized head. It was too far away to make out details, but its posture suggested it was watching us with the same intensity we were watching it. "Is it human?" Camille asked, though her voice suggested she already knew the answer. "No," I said with certainty I couldn't explain. "Look at how it's standing. Look at the shape of its head." We watched in fascinated horror as the thing moved slightly, shifting its position among the trees but never stepping into full view. Its movements were fluid but somehow wrong, as if its joints bent in ways human joints shouldn't. "We should get Dad," Camille said, but neither of us moved toward the door. "He's too far away. By the time we could signal him, it'll be gone." As if responding to our conversation, the figure took a step closer to the water's edge. For the first time, we could see it clearly, and what we saw made my knees go weak. It was definitely not human. The head was elongated and appeared to be covered in coarse hair or fur. The arms were too long, hanging nearly to its knees, and ended in what looked like oversized hands. Most disturbing of all was its stance. It stood perfectly upright on 2 legs, but there was something in its posture that suggested it was equally comfortable on 4. "It's watching us," Camille said, and she was right. Even at this distance, there was no mistaking the direction of its attention. It stood motionless among the trees, focused entirely on our island. "How long has it been there?" I wondered aloud. "How long has it been watching us without us knowing?" The thought sent a wave of nausea through me. We had been so focused on the isolation, on being alone in the wilderness, that we hadn't considered the possibility that we weren't alone at all. That something had been observing us from the moment we arrived. As we watched, the creature raised one of its elongated arms and seemed to point directly at us. The gesture was so deliberate, so clearly directed, that it felt like a communication. Though what it was trying to communicate, I didn't want to know. "We need to get inside," Camille said, backing away from the window. "We need to lock the door and wait for Dad to come back." But I found myself unable to move. Despite my terror, I was transfixed by the thing across the water. There was something almost hypnotic about its presence, something that made me want to understand what it was, what it wanted. "Look," I said, pointing to the water between us and the creature. "How deep do you think it is right there?" "Why?" Camille asked, alarm creeping into her voice. "I'm just wondering, could it swim across? Could it reach us if it wanted to?" The question hung between us like a physical thing. The stretch of water that had seemed like protection now felt inadequate, insubstantial. If this thing was intelligent enough to use tools, strong enough to stand upright despite its obvious size, what would stop it from simply swimming to our island? As if reading my thoughts, the creature took another step toward the water, then another. It was now standing at the very edge of the lake, close enough that I could see the way water lapped around its feet. It appeared to be testing the depth, evaluating the distance to our island. "It's going to come across," Camille said, her voice rising in panic. "It's going to swim over here." But the creature didn't enter the water. Instead, it stood there for several more minutes, watching us with an intensity that felt almost physical. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it stepped backward into the forest and vanished among the trees. We stood at the window for a long time afterward, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. But the forest had returned to its previous stillness, as if nothing had happened at all. "Did we really see that?" Camille asked finally. "We both saw it," I confirmed, though part of me was already beginning to doubt my own memory. The whole encounter had a dreamlike quality that made it difficult to believe it had really occurred. We moved away from the window and sat at the small table in the center of the cabin. Neither of us spoke for several minutes, each lost in our own thoughts about what we had witnessed. "Should we tell Dad?" Camille asked eventually. I considered this. Would he believe us? Probably not. He'd think we were letting our imaginations run wild, being teenage girls alone in the wilderness. She was probably right. Dad was a practical man who dealt in facts and figures, import regulations, and shipping schedules. The idea that his daughters had seen some kind of unknown creature watching them from across a remote lake would likely strike him as the product of overactive adolescent minds. "But what if it comes back?" I asked. "What if it was real and it comes back tonight?" Neither of us had an answer for that question. The men returned from their afternoon fishing expedition in high spirits, having caught several more large fish despite their strange condition. Dad was particularly pleased with a massive walleye that Bernard claimed was the largest he'd seen in years. Their enthusiasm provided a sharp contrast to the tension that had been building in Camille and me all afternoon. "You two look like you've seen a ghost," Pascal observed as they tied up the boats. His English was improving with practice, and his powers of observation were uncomfortably acute. "Just tired," Camille said quickly, shooting me a warning look. But as the evening progressed, our attempt to act normal became increasingly difficult. Every sound from outside made us jump. Every shadow that moved past the windows sent us into high alert. When the wind picked up after dinner, causing tree branches to scrape against the cabin's roof, I nearly knocked over my coffee cup. "Everything all right?" Dad asked, studying my face with concern. "Just not used to all these wilderness sounds," I said, forcing a smile. "It's a lot quieter here than at home." Bernard nodded knowingly. "The silence takes getting used to. In Montreal, there's always traffic, always people. Out here, every small sound seems amplified." But it wasn't the small sounds that were bothering me. It was the absence of normal sounds, bird calls, insect noise, the rustling of small animals in the underbrush. The forest across the water remained unnaturally quiet, as if everything living had fled the area. As darkness fell, we gathered around the wood stove to play cards and share stories. Pascal proved to be more talkative in the evening, telling us about his studies in biology and his plans to become a wildlife researcher. His knowledge of the local ecosystem was impressive and disturbing. "This region has one of the highest biodiversity indexes in North America," he explained, as we played poker with matchsticks for stakes, or at least it used to. Recent surveys have shown dramatic population declines in multiple species. "What kind of declines?" Dad asked, his business instincts picking up on something significant. "Birds mostly. Songbirds, raptors, even scavengers like ravens. Some species that were common 5 years ago have virtually disappeared from these forests." "What's causing it?" Camille asked, though something in her voice suggested she didn't really want to know the answer. Pascal exchanged a look with his father before responding. "The official explanation is climate change, habitat disruption from logging, pollution from mining operations upstream. But the pattern doesn't match what we'd expect from those causes." "What do you mean?" I pressed. "The disappearances are too sudden, too complete, and they're not random. It's as if something is specifically targeting the animals that would normally sound warnings when predators are present." Bernard shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Pascal reads too many scientific journals," he said with forced lightness. "Sometimes the simplest explanations are the correct ones." But Pascal continued, ignoring his father's obvious discomfort. "And there are the reports from other guides, other fishing parties. Strange sightings, unusual animal behavior. Dennis mentioned that 3 groups have cut their trips short this summer because of incidents." "What kind of incidents?" Dad asked, his voice taking on a sharper edge. "Campers reporting feeling watched, finding unusual tracks around their sites, hearing sounds that don't match any known wildlife. One group from Toronto claimed something large was circling their camp all night, just outside the range of their flashlights. I felt my stomach clench. Did they see what it was? They said it was tall, moved on two legs, and seemed to be studying them rather than hunting them, like it was trying to understand what they were. The cabin fell silent, except for the crackling of the fire. Outside, the wind had died down, leaving us in the absolute quiet that I was beginning to associate with this place. But tonight, the silence felt different, expectant, as if something was waiting. "Well," Dad said finally, "I think that's enough ghost stories for one evening. We should get some rest if we want to get an early start tomorrow." But even as we prepared for bed, I could see that Pascal's stories had affected everyone. Bernard seemed nervous, constantly glancing toward the windows. Dad checked the door locks twice, something I'd never seen him do at home. Even Camille, who usually fell asleep instantly, lay in her bunk, staring at the ceiling. I was just beginning to drift off when the sound started. At first, it was just a low rumble, so quiet I thought it might be distant thunder. But thunder doesn't maintain a steady rhythm, and thunder doesn't seem to move through the landscape in patterns. This sound was clearly communication, not random noise, but purposeful calls and responses echoing across the water. "Are you hearing this?" Camille whispered from the bunk above me. "Yes," I whispered back, grateful that I wasn't imagining it. The sounds were coming from multiple directions now, surrounding the lake with a chorus of deep, resonant calls that seemed to vibrate through the water and into the island itself. They varied in pitch and duration, but there was an unmistakable structure to them, as if different voices were contributing to a complex conversation. From Dad's bunk came a sharp intake of breath. "What in God's name?" he murmured. "They do this every night," Pascal said quietly from his corner of the cabin. "Sometimes for hours." "Why didn't you warn us?" Dad demanded, sitting up in his bunk. "Would you have believed me?" Pascal replied. "Would you have come if I'd told you that something unknown lives in these forests and calls to itself all night long?" The sounds grew louder, more insistent. Through the thin walls of the cabin, we could hear them clearly now, not just calls, but what sounded almost like language. Different tones, different rhythms, as if multiple entities were engaged in complex communication across vast distances. "It's all around us," Camille observed, her voice tight with fear. "The sounds are coming from every direction." She was right. Whatever was making these calls had positioned itself around the entire perimeter of the lake. We were surrounded, isolated in the center of some kind of gathering that we didn't understand. Then, just as suddenly as they had started, the sounds stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the noise had been. It felt heavy, pregnant with menace, as if something had been decided and we were about to discover what it was. "Stay in your bunks," Dad ordered quietly. "Don't go near the windows." But even as he spoke, we could hear something new, the sound of water lapping against our dock, but with a rhythm that suggested movement rather than waves. Something was in the water, something large enough to displace substantial amounts of liquid as it moved. "It's circling the island," Pascal whispered, "just like the Toronto group described." The sound continued for what felt like hours, steady, methodical, as if something was conducting a thorough reconnaissance of our position. Occasionally, we'd hear other sounds, the scrape of something against the dock, the creak of the rowboats as they were moved by whatever was in the water, splashing that seemed too controlled to be natural. None of us slept that night. We lay in our bunks, listening to the sounds of something unknown, examining our refuge, testing our defenses, learning everything it needed to know about us. When dawn finally came, the sounds faded with the darkness. But as I looked out the window at the calm surface of the lake, I could see clear evidence that our nocturnal visitor had been real. The rowboats had been moved, turned around so they faced the mainland instead of the open water. And around the perimeter of the island, the muddy shore was marked with tracks, large, elongated impressions that definitely hadn't been made by human feet. Morning brought no relief from the tension that had been building since our arrival. If anything, daylight made our situation feel more precarious. The evidence of our nighttime visitor was undeniable. The rearranged boats, the strange tracks in the mud, and most disturbing of all, what appeared to be deliberate arrangements of stones and driftwood around the island's perimeter. "Someone's playing a prank," Dad said, but his voice lacked conviction as he examined the tracks. They were unlike anything in his experience. roughly human in shape, but nearly twice the size, with what appeared to be claw marks at the toe ends. "What kind of person could make tracks this large?" Camille asked, kneeling beside one of the clearest impressions. "And how would they get here without a boat?" Bernard was studying the stone arrangements with obvious distress. "These patterns," he murmured to himself in French, then switched to English. "These are organized, purposeful." "What do you mean?" I asked, though part of me didn't want to know. "In my culture, we have stories about markers, signs left by things that want to communicate but don't use human language. These stones, they're arranged in specific ways." "What are they trying to communicate?" Dad asked, his practical mind still looking for rational explanations. Bernard hesitated. "Territory, ownership, warning." Pascal, who had been quiet during this discussion, suddenly spoke up. "We should leave. Today. Now." "Don't be ridiculous," Dad said. "We're paid for 3 days, and we've only been here 2. Besides, there's a logical explanation for all of this." "What logical explanation?" I challenged. "What person or animal could do all this without us hearing them land on the island? And why would they rearrange our boats to face the mainland?" Dad didn't have an answer for that. Despite the mounting evidence that something was very wrong, the men decided to continue with their planned fishing expedition. I think Dad was determined not to let his business relationship with Bernard be damaged by what he still insisted on treating as unexplained but ultimately harmless phenomena. Camille and I refused to leave the island again. The idea of being on the open water, exposed and vulnerable, was too terrifying to contemplate. We would stay at the cabin, keep the fire going, and try to make sense of what was happening to us. "Don't go far from shore," I begged Dad as they prepared to launch the boats. "Stay where we can see you." He promised they would, but as we watched them row away, they quickly disappeared into the maze of channels and bays that made up the lake system. Within minutes, we were alone again, surrounded by dark water and hostile wilderness. The day passed slowly. Camille and I took turns standing watch at different windows, scanning the mainland shore for any sign of movement. We saw nothing concrete, but the feeling of being observed never left us. It was as if the forest itself had eyes, as if every shadow concealed something watching, waiting, evaluating. Around midday, we made a discovery that sent our fear into new territory. While organizing the supplies, Camille found a notebook that had been left behind by previous visitors. Most of the entries were routine: fishing reports, weather observations, complaints about insects. But the final entry, dated just 2 months earlier, was different. "Day 3, something wrong here. Jim saw it first, near the big pine on North Shore. Tall, wrong shape, watching us. Tracks around camp this morning. Sarah wants to leave, but boat won't start. Engine turns over, but won't catch. It's like something doesn't want us to go. Getting dark again. Can hear them calling to each other. More than one now. God help us if they decide to swim across." The entry ended there, with no indication of how the situation resolved. "Do you think they made it out?" Camille asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "The notebook's still here," I pointed out. "Either they left in a hurry or—" I didn't finish the thought. Neither of us wanted to consider the alternatives. As the afternoon wore on, our nervousness increased. The men had been gone for hours, much longer than planned. From our vantage point on the island, we could see portions of the lake, but not the areas where they typically fished. If something had happened to them, we would have no way of knowing. "What if they don't come back?" Camille asked as shadows began to lengthen across the water. "They'll come back," I said with more confidence than I felt. "Dad's too stubborn to let anything stop him from keeping his word." But as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, our confidence wavered. The absolute silence that had characterized this place since our arrival seemed to intensify as darkness approached. Even the wind died down, leaving the surface of the lake perfectly still. That's when we heard the sound of an engine. Relief flooded through me as one of the aluminum boats came into view. Bernard at the oars, while Dad worked the small outboard motor. But as they drew closer, I could see that something was wrong. They were rowing frantically, and both men kept looking over their shoulders as if something was pursuing them. The second boat was nowhere to be seen. "Where's Pascal?" Camille called as they reached the dock. "Get inside," Dad shouted instead of answering. "Now, get everything inside." We helped them haul the boat onto shore and carry their equipment into the cabin. Both men were pale and breathing hard, as if they'd been rowing at maximum speed for hours. "Where's the other boat?" I demanded once we were inside with the door locked. "Where's Pascal?" Bernard collapsed into a chair, his head in his hands. "Gone," he said in a broken voice. "The boat is gone. Pascal is gone." "What do you mean gone?" Camille asked, though her voice suggested she didn't want to know the answer. Dad set up the wood stove with shaking hands. "We were fishing in the deep water about a mile north of here. Pascal and I were in one boat, Bernard in the other. Everything was normal until about 3 o'clock. That's when the fish stopped biting," Bernard continued. "All at once, like someone had flipped a switch. The lake went completely dead. Then we heard the calls," Dad said. "Just like last night, but during the day, coming from the shore all around us." "Pascal started getting agitated," Bernard explained. "He kept saying we needed to leave, that they were getting ready to do something. I told him to calm down, but then—" He trailed off, unable to continue. "Then what?" I pressed. Dad took over the story. "Something surfaced near Pascal's boat, something large. We only saw it for a few seconds before it went back down, but it was big enough to create waves that rocked both boats." "What did it look like?" Camille asked. "Dark," Bernard said. "Very dark, and much larger than any fish. It moved intelligently, with purpose." "Pascal panicked," Dad continued. "He started rowing toward shore, saying he was going to beach the boat and walk back to the outfitter's station. We tried to follow him, but he was rowing like his life depended on it." "What happened then?" I asked, though I was beginning to dread the answer. "He made it about halfway to shore," Bernard said, his voice barely audible. "Then something grabbed his boat from underneath. We saw it lift partially out of the water, saw Pascal try to fight whatever had hold of it. Then the boat went under, and Pascal went with it." The cabin fell silent except for the crackling of the fire. Outside, darkness was settling over the lake like a blanket. "Did you see him surface?" Camille asked desperately. "Did you try to help him?" "We searched for over an hour," Dad said. "Called his name, dove in the water where we last saw him. There was nothing. The boat, Pascal, everything just disappeared." "It wasn't an accident," Bernard said suddenly, his voice filled with conviction. "Whatever lives in this lake, whatever's been watching us, it took my son deliberately, and now it knows we're here alone." As if in response to his words, the night sounds began, the deep, resonant calls echoing across the water from multiple directions. But tonight they sounded different, more urgent, more coordinated, and they were definitely getting closer. None of us slept that night. We huddled in the cabin listening to the sounds outside, not just the calling now, but splashing, movement in the water around our island, and occasionally the scrape of something large against our dock. Several times we heard what sounded like tentative scratching at the cabin walls, as if something was testing the strength of our shelter. "They're learning about us," Bernard said during one of the quiet periods. "Studying our defenses, figuring out how to get inside." "You're anthropomorphizing," Dad insisted, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. "Animals don't plan complex attacks." "These aren't animals," Bernard replied. "At least not animals as we understand them." Around 3 in the morning, the sounds changed character entirely. Instead of the random calling and movement we'd grown accustomed to, we began to hear what could only be described as organized activity. Rhythmic splashing suggested multiple entities moving in coordinated patterns around the island. The calls became shorter, sharper, more like commands than conversation. "They're organizing," I whispered, voicing what we were all thinking. Through the small window that faced the mainland, we could see lights, not electric lights, but a strange, phosphorescent glow that seemed to move through the forest at about head height. The lights appeared and disappeared among the trees, sometimes single points, sometimes clusters, always moving with purpose. "Bioluminescence," Bernard murmured, pressing his face to the window. "Some deep-water species can produce their own light." "But we're not underwater," Camille pointed out. "We're looking at the forest." The implications of that observation settled over us like ice water. Whatever was producing those lights was equally comfortable in aquatic and terrestrial environments. Whatever we were dealing with, it wasn't bound by the limitations that constrained normal wildlife. As dawn approached, the activity around our island intensified, We could hear multiple large bodies moving through the water, could feel the cabin shaking slightly as heavy impacts struck the dock. At one point, something began testing the door, pushing against it with increasing force until Dad threw his full weight against it to keep it closed. "The motor," he said suddenly. "If we can get to the boat, start the motor." "They'll be waiting for that," Bernard said. "Whatever happened to Pascal will happen to us." "We can't just sit here and wait for them to break in," Dad argued. But that's exactly what we did. We sat in the growing daylight, listening to the sounds of multiple entities exploring every inch of our tiny refuge, testing every possible entry point, learning everything they needed to know about our position. When full daylight finally arrived, the sounds gradually faded. Whatever was out there seemed to prefer darkness for its activities. But the silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was the silence of something waiting, something patient enough to bide its time until conditions were optimal. "We need to signal for help," Camille said as we cautiously peered out the windows. "Dennis said he'd be back to check on us." "When?" Dad asked. "Tomorrow. He said he'd return tomorrow to pick us up." "That's assuming he comes at all," Bernard said grimly. "And assuming we last until tomorrow." I was studying the shoreline through binoculars when I saw something that made my stomach clench. "There are more tracks," I announced, "all around the island, and they're different." The others joined me at the window to look. The muddy shore that surrounded our island was now covered with tracks, not just the large, elongated prints we'd seen before, but smaller ones, different shapes, as if multiple species had visited us during the night. "It's like a conference," Camille observed with dark humor. "They all came to discuss what to do about us." "Don't joke," Bernard snapped. "My son is dead because of these things, and we're next if we don't find a way out of here." But what options did we have? Our remaining boat had a small outboard motor, but we'd seen what had happened to Pascal when he tried to escape across the water. The island offered no hiding places, no defensive positions except the cabin itself, and we had food and water for perhaps another day, certainly not long enough to wait for rescue. "There's something else," I said, continuing to scan the shoreline with the binoculars. "Some of the trees near the water's edge have been modified." "What do you mean?" Dad asked, taking the binoculars from me. "Branches broken off at specific heights, bark stripped in patterns. It's like they're marking territory or leaving messages." Dad studied the modified trees for several minutes before lowering the binoculars with a troubled expression. "You're right, that's not random damage. Someone or something is deliberately altering the landscape." The day passed with agonizing slowness. We took turns on watch duty, scanning the lake and forest for any sign of movement. The water remained perfectly calm, the forest unnaturally still, but the feeling of being observed never left us. It was as if hundreds of eyes were watching our every move, waiting for the right moment to act. Around midday, we made a decision that probably saved our lives. Instead of waiting for whatever lived in the lake to make the next move, we decided to actively prepare for the coming night. We moved all the furniture in the cabin to barricade the door and windows. We prepared weapons, kitchen knives, a hatchet for splitting wood, anything that might serve as a defense. Most importantly, we developed a plan. "If they break in," Dad said, "we don't try to fight them in here. We run for the boat immediately. No hesitation, no looking back. Our only chance is to reach the motor and get far enough from shore that they can't reach us." "What about Dennis?" Camille asked. "If he comes to pick us up and finds the cabin destroyed." "Then he'll know what happened here," Bernard said, "and maybe he'll warn others to stay away." As the afternoon wore on, we began to notice subtle changes in our environment. The water around the island, which had been clear enough to see the bottom in shallow areas, was becoming darker, more opaque. The air itself seemed thicker, carrying unfamiliar scents that reminded me of deep ocean environments despite our inland location. "They're changing the chemistry of the lake," Bernard observed, studying a sample of water we'd drawn from near the dock. "Increasing the salinity, altering the pH, making it more suitable for whatever they are." "That's impossible," Dad protested. "It would take industrial equipment to alter the chemistry of a body of water this size." "Unless they're doing it biologically," Bernard countered. "Some marine organisms can dramatically alter their local environment through metabolic processes, if there are enough of them." The implications were staggering. We weren't dealing with a few isolated creatures. We were dealing with an entire ecosystem, one that was actively reshaping the lake to suit its needs. As sunset approached, we made our final preparations. The boat was positioned for immediate escape, with the motor primed and ready to start. We had identified the fastest route from the cabin to the dock. Each of us knew our role in the escape plan. All we had to do was survive until Dennis arrived the following day. But as darkness fell and the calling began again, louder, more coordinated, more urgent than ever before, I began to doubt whether any of us would see another sunrise. The final night was unlike anything we had experienced before. The sounds that surrounded our island weren't just calls anymore. They were a symphony of communication that suggested intelligence, organization, and most terrifyingly, planning. Through the thin walls of the cabin, we could hear what sounded like deliberate consultation, as if multiple entities were discussing strategies in a language we couldn't understand. Around midnight, they began testing our defenses in earnest. The first assault came against the door. Not random pushing or scratching, but systematic pressure applied at specific points. The hinges, the frame, the lock mechanism. Whatever was out there understood how human construction worked and was methodically testing for weaknesses. "They're problem-solving," Bernard whispered as we huddled in the center of the cabin, weapons ready. "They understand cause and effect." When the door held, they turned their attention to the windows. We could hear something moving around the exterior of the cabin, testing each window in turn. The barricades we'd erected held, but we could see them flexing under pressure as whatever was outside pushed against them with increasing force. Then came the sound that nearly broke our resolve entirely: footsteps on the roof. Something large was moving across the cabin's roof with deliberate, measured steps. We could track its progress by the creaking of the wooden beams overhead. It moved from one end of the cabin to the other, then back again, as if studying the structure from above. "The chimney," Dad said suddenly. "They're going to try to come down the chimney." We turned our attention to the wood stove, where we could hear scratching sounds coming from the flue. But the opening was too small for anything substantial to pass through, and the fire we kept burning would deter most attempts at entry. The siege continued for hours. Sustained pressure against the door and windows, movement on the roof, splashing in the water as multiple entities circled the island. At one point, we heard what sounded like tools being used. Scraping, grinding sounds that suggested they were trying to create new entry points. "They're adapting," I observed, with growing terror, learning from each failed attempt. But our barricades held. The cabin, despite its rustic construction, proved surprisingly resilient against whatever was trying to get inside. As dawn approached, the attacks gradually ceased, leaving us exhausted but alive in the growing daylight. When we finally dared to look outside, the evidence of the night's assault was undeniable. The doorframe was gouged with deep scratches. The window barriers showed impact marks from something with substantial strength. Most disturbing of all, we found tools around the perimeter of the cabin, crude implements that appeared to be made from stones and driftwood, but shaped with obvious intelligence for specific purposes. "They're not just intelligent," Bernard said as he examined one of the tools. "They're advancing, learning to use implements, to modify their environment." We were still processing this discovery when we heard the sound of a boat engine in the distance. Dennis had come to rescue us, exactly as promised. Relief flooded through me as his boat came into view, but it was tempered by the knowledge that we had to reach him safely. The stretch of water between our island and Dennis's boat suddenly seemed vast and filled with potential danger. "All together," Dad commanded as we gathered at the dock. "No one gets left behind." Our escape was a nightmare of terror and adrenaline. We launched our boat and started the motor without incident, but as soon as we began moving toward Dennis, the water around us erupted with activity. Dark shapes moved beneath the surface, sometimes bumping against our hull with impacts that threatened to capsize us. "Faster!" Bernard shouted as Dad opened the throttle to maximum. The things in the water were keeping pace with us, rising occasionally to the surface where we could catch glimpses of massive forms that defied easy description. They were pursuing us with obvious coordination, trying to herd us toward deeper water where they would have the advantage. Dennis, seeing our distress, gunned his own engine and came to meet us halfway. The final minutes of our escape played out like a scene from a nightmare, two small boats racing across dark water while unknown entities circled beneath us, trying to prevent our escape. We made it. Barely, but we made it. The ride back to the outfitter's station passed in silence. Dennis asked no questions about Pascal's absence, and we offered no explanations. Some truths are too large, too impossible, to share with someone who wasn't there to witness them. The drive home was equally quiet. Bernard had lost his son and aged 10 years in 3 days. Dad's business relationship was obviously over, though neither man spoke about the financial implications. Camille and I sat in the back seat, watching the wilderness gradually give way to civilization, trying to process what we had experienced. It wasn't until we reached Montreal that anyone spoke about what had happened. "No one will believe us," Camille said as we stopped for gas. "Maybe that's for the best," Dad replied. "Maybe some things are better left unknown." But I couldn't accept that. Pascal had died out there, and something had to be done to prevent it from happening to others. When we reached home, I began researching the area where we'd been fishing. What I found was disturbing. Over the past decade, there had been a steady pattern of disappearances in that region. Fishing parties that failed to return, solo campers who vanished without trace, guides who went missing during routine trips. The official explanations varied: equipment failure, falls into deep water, attacks by known predators, but the pattern was unmistakable. Something in those remote forests and lakes was taking people. I tried to contact authorities to report what we had seen and experienced. But Dad was right. No one believed us. The story was too fantastic, too far outside normal experience. Officials politely took my statements and filed them away, probably assuming I was suffering from trauma-induced hallucinations. Bernard returned to Montreal and never contacted us again. Through business acquaintances, Dad learned that he had sold his textile operation and moved away from Quebec entirely. He never spoke publicly about his son's disappearance, and Pascal was officially listed as a drowning victim. Years have passed since that trip. I finished high school, graduated from college, started a career. I've traveled extensively, visited wilderness areas around the world, even returned to northern Canada on several occasions. But I've never been back to that specific lake, never tried to retrace our route to that isolated island. Sometimes, though, I find myself studying maps of northern Quebec, trying to identify the exact location where we encountered, whatever those things were. Part of me wants to organize a proper expedition, to return with cameras and recording equipment, to document the evidence, and force the world to acknowledge what exists in those remote waters. But a larger part of me remembers the fear, the absolute helplessness we felt during those 3 days. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. Some truths are too dangerous to pursue. Whatever lives in that lake, it's still there, still watching, still waiting for the next group of unsuspecting visitors to venture into its territory. And someday, God help us all, someone else will discover what we discovered. Someone else will experience the terror of being hunted by something that shouldn't exist. I only pray that when that day comes, they're better prepared than we were. The wilderness keeps its secrets. But sometimes, late at night when the world is quiet and still, I can almost hear those deep, resonant calls echoing across the water, reminding me that some places on Earth don't belong to us. They never did. For 15 years, I've lived my life behind the wheel of a Peterbilt, watching America scroll by through my windshield like an endless documentary on the changing landscape of this vast country. The rhythmic hum of 18 wheels on asphalt has been my lullaby, and truck stop coffee my lifeblood. The names Hank Mercer and long-haul trucking isn't just my profession, it's my calling. Most people don't understand the solitude of the open road, the strange brotherhood that exists among those of us who spend more time in our cabs than in our homes. We're modern-day nomads, delivering the lifeblood of commerce across state lines while the rest of the world sleeps. It's not glamorous, but there's a freedom to it that gets in your blood and never leaves. That Wednesday in late October started like any other. I was at the Flying J outside of Butte, Montana, loading up on caffeine before heading east with a trailer full of industrial equipment bound for Minneapolis. The morning air had that sharp bite that signals winter's approach in the northern states, crisp enough to make your lungs ache if you breathe too deeply. "Gonna be a cold one tonight, Hank," said Doris, the night shift waitress who'd been serving me eggs and hash browns for the better part of a decade. She topped off my coffee with practiced precision. "They're saying snow in the passes by tomorrow." "Appreciate the heads up," I replied, leaving her a generous tip before heading back to my rig. "I'll try to beat it through to Billings before it hits." My truck was a 2019 Peterbilt 389 midnight blue with chrome accents that caught the early morning sun like liquid silver. Not the newest model, but maintained with religious devotion. In this business, your rig is your livelihood, your home, and sometimes your only companion. I settled into the worn leather seat, adjusted my mirrors, and began my pre-drive check, a ritual as familiar as brushing my teeth. The diesel engine rumbled to life, a comforting growl that vibrated through the cabin. The dispatcher had already sent my route details to my phone, but something about technology still felt intrusive in the sanctuary of my cab. I preferred paper maps and instinct. Old school, Randy called it. Randy Wilcox had been my road buddy for nearly 7 years, ever since we got stranded at the same truck stop during an ice storm in Wyoming. He was hauling produce west while I was headed east with electronics. We ended up playing cards for 12 hours straight, swapping stories about life on the road, and formed a friendship that stuck. We tried to sync our routes when possible, kept in touch by CB, and always had each other's backs. "Breaker 19, this is Blue Thunder. Randy, you got your ears on?" I spoke into the CB radio, using the handle I'd had since my first solo run. Static crackled before Randy's voice came through. "Morning, Hank. I'm about 50 miles east of you on I-90. Clear sailing so far." "Good to hear. I'm rolling out now. Should catch up to you by lunchtime." "Roger that. Smoky report is all clear. See you at the usual spot." The usual spot was a small roadside diner just outside of Livingston, family-owned, great food, and off the beaten path enough that it wasn't overrun with tourists. Randy and I tried to meet there whenever our routes aligned. As I pulled onto the interstate, the rising sun painted the Montana mountains in shades of purple and gold. Moments like these were why I could never give up the road, the solitary witness to America waking up, the ever-changing tableau of natural beauty that most people only see in photographs. The first few hours passed without incident. Traffic was light, the weather held, and the satellite radio kept me company with a mixture of classic rock and true crime podcasts. I'd always had a fascination with the darker side of human nature. Something about the isolation of the highway made you think about vulnerability and the thin line between safety and danger. It was nearly noon when my GPS alerted me to a traffic delay ahead. An accident had closed 2 lanes about 20 miles up, causing a backup that would add at least an hour to my drive time. The dispatcher's voice crackled over the radio. "Hank, you seeing that mess on I-90? "Just got the alert," I confirmed, looking at a significant delay. "There's a detour you can take. Old service road that runs parallel for about 30 miles. Might save you some time. I'm sending the directions to your phone now." I frowned. Detours weren't uncommon, but I preferred sticking to main routes, especially in mountain country where service roads could quickly become treacherous. Still, time was money in this business, and the client in Minneapolis was expecting their delivery by Friday morning. "Copy that, I'll check it out." The directions led me to an exit I'd passed dozens of times but never taken, a narrow off-ramp that disappeared into dense pine forest. A weathered sign indicated it was Forest Service Road 217, but the paint was so faded it was barely legible. Something about it made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I hesitated, then reached for my phone to call Randy. "Hey, dispatch is routing me on some Forest Service road to bypass an accident. You ever take 217 near Belgrade?" Randy's voice came through, breaking up slightly. "Can't say I have. Sounds sketchy. Might be better to delay." His voice dissolved into static, then silence. Cell reception was spotty in these mountains at the best of times. I drummed my fingers on the steering wheel, considering my options. The traffic report now showed the backup extending for miles, with no estimated clearance time. The detour would save me hours, if it worked out. "Ah, hell," I muttered, and turned onto the exit. Little did I know that this simple decision, one made by truckers every day, would change my life forever, that it would lead me down a twisted path into darkness, that by nightfall I would be fighting for my life in a remote clearing, bleeding from a shotgun wound, with no one but the stars to witness my struggle. But that's getting ahead of the story. First, I had to make my way down that lonely forest road, where the shadows seemed to deepen with every mile, and the strange sense of being watched grew stronger with each passing moment. Forest Service Road 217 started innocently enough, a two-lane paved road winding through towering pines. My GPS showed it running roughly parallel to the interstate for about 30 miles before reconnecting near Bozeman. The dispatcher had said it would save me time, but something felt off from the moment my tires hit the pavement. The road was eerily empty. No other vehicles, no signs of maintenance, just an endless corridor of trees pressing in from both sides. The pavement gradually deteriorated, cracked asphalt giving way to patches of gravel, then back to pavement so weathered it looked ancient. My rig bounced and swayed, the load shifting slightly behind me. Should have stuck to the damn interstate, I muttered, slowing to a crawl over a particularly rough section. 2 hours in, and I was beginning to think I'd made a serious miscalculation. The GPS signal kept cutting out, leaving me with nothing but my own sense of direction and the vague notion that I was still heading east. The forest had thickened to the point where midday sunlight barely penetrated the canopy, casting the road in a perpetual twilight. I tried the CB again. Breaker 19, this is Blue Thunder. Anybody copy? Nothing but static answered me. My phone showed no service. The radio stations had dissolved into white noise miles back, and the only sound was the labored breathing of my engine as it navigated the increasingly challenging terrain. I was completely alone. It was around 3 p.m. when I spotted the first sign of human presence, a rusted mailbox tilting drunkenly at the mouth of a narrow dirt driveway. No name, no address, just a silent sentinel at the edge of the forest. As I passed, I caught a glimpse of something down that driveway. What might have been a cabin, or perhaps just a shadow playing tricks on my eyes. The road grew narrower, forcing me to slow to a crawl. My 18-wheeler was never meant for routes like this, and I cursed myself for not trusting my initial instincts. The dispatcher had clearly never driven this road herself, or she'd never have suggested it for a rig my size. Another hour passed. The GPS flickered back to life momentarily, showing me miles from where I thought I was, deeper into the national forest, on a road that didn't seem to have any connection to the interstate at all. Then it died again, the screen going black as if to emphasize my isolation. As daylight began to fade, panic crept in around the edges of my thoughts. I was low on fuel, with no idea how far it was to the next town. Turning around on this narrow road would be nearly impossible with my trailer. The only option was to press forward and hope the road eventually led somewhere. That's when I spotted the clearing. It opened up suddenly on my right. A wide, flat area just off the road that looked like it might have been used for logging operations once upon a time. Large enough to park my rig and reassess the situation. Maybe even attempt a three-point turn if necessary. I pulled off the road, the tires crunching on gravel and pine needles. The engine sighed with relief as I cut the ignition. The sudden silence was absolute, pressing against my eardrums like a physical force. No birds, no insects, no distant traffic noise, just the occasional ping of cooling metal from my engine. Stepping down from the cab, I stretched my cramped muscles and took stock of my surroundings. The clearing was roughly circular, maybe 100 yards across, bordered on all sides by dense forest. The trees seemed to lean inward, as if studying this human intruder in their domain. The air smelled of pine resin and something else, something metallic and unpleasant that I couldn't quite identify. My watch showed 5:17 p.m. Daylight was already fading, and with it, any realistic hope of finding my way back to civilization before dark. I reached for my phone again, still no service. The CB radio in my truck remained stubbornly silent. I was deciding whether to spend the night in my cab or risk driving further in the dark when I heard it, the distant rumble of an approaching vehicle. Relief washed over me. Another soul on this godforsaken road meant potential help, or at least information about where the hell I was. The sound grew louder, and I moved to the edge of the clearing to flag down the approaching driver. The vehicle rounded the bend, an old Ford pickup truck, once white but now a patchwork of rust and primer. It slowed as it approached the clearing, then turned in, headlights sweeping across me like searchlights. The truck stopped about 30 yards away, engine idling roughly. The headlights remained on, blinding me and preventing me from seeing the driver clearly. A moment passed, then another. Nobody emerged from the cab. "Hello?" I called out, raising a hand to shield my eyes from the glare. "You from around here? I could use some directions." The driver's door creaked open, and a figure stepped out, tall and lean, silhouetted against the headlights. Something about the deliberate way he moved sent a chill down my spine. He stood there for a long moment, just watching me. "Road's not meant for big rigs," he finally said, his voice a gravelly rasp that barely carried across the clearing. "You're lost." It wasn't a question, but I answered anyway. "Yeah, trying to bypass an accident on I-90. GPS routed me this way." He laughed, a dry sound like autumn leaves skittering across pavement. "Ain't no way back to the interstate from here, not for something that size." He began walking toward me, his movements stiff but purposeful. As he got closer, details emerged from the shadows. Faded flannel shirt, work-worn jeans, beard streaked with gray. His face remained in shadow, but I could feel his eyes on me, assessing. "Where does this road lead, then?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual despite the growing unease in my gut. "Know where you want to go." He stopped about 10 feet away, just close enough for me to make out his features in the fading light. Deep-set eyes, hollow cheeks, skin weathered by decades of mountain sun and wind. But it was his expression that froze my blood, utterly emotionless, eyes flat and cold as river stones. I noticed then what he carried, a shotgun held casually at his side as if it were simply an extension of his arm. "That's quite a greeting," I said, nodding toward the weapon. "Bears in these woods," he replied tonelessly. "Never know what you might run into." My eyes darted back to my truck, calculating the distance. My own firearm was locked in the glove compartment. Might as well have been on the moon for all the good it did me now. "Look," I said, forcing a smile. "I'm just trying to get back to the main road. If you could point me in the right direction, I'll be on my way." "What's your hurry?" he asked, taking another step forward. "Night's coming on. Dangerous to drive these roads in the dark." Every instinct I had was screaming danger. 15 years on the road, I'd encountered all types: helpful locals, suspicious rednecks, tweakers looking for easy targets. This man was something else entirely. There was no emotion behind his eyes, no humanity I could appeal to. "I appreciate the concern," I said, beginning to edge back toward my truck. "But I really need to—" "Empty your pockets," he cut in, raising the shotgun slightly. Nice and slow. The game was up. This wasn't about directions or mountain hospitality. This was a robbery, plain and simple. Or something worse. "Take it easy," I said, my hands rising instinctively. "I don't want any trouble." "Pockets, now." The shotgun was pointed at my chest, his finger hovering near the trigger. Slowly, I reached into my jacket, pulling out my wallet. "Look, there's about 200 in cash. Take it and let me be on my way." "All of it," he insisted. "Phone too." I complied, removing my phone and a couple packs of cigarettes I kept for the long hauls. He stepped forward, snatching the items from my outstretched hand and pocketing the wallet and phone. The cigarettes he examined briefly before tucking them away as well. "What do you want?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady despite the fear coursing through me. He didn't answer, just raised the shotgun and took aim. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I looked around for anything I could use as a weapon, but the clearing was empty, save for some rocks and sticks. In that moment, staring down the barrel of that shotgun, I realized with perfect clarity that I was going to die here, in this nameless clearing, miles from anywhere, at the hands of a stranger whose motivation I couldn't begin to understand. All the miles I'd driven, all the sunrises I'd witnessed from my cab, all the plans I had, none of it mattered now. The man's finger tightened on the trigger, and I braced myself for the end. Before I could react, he fired. The blast was deafening, echoing through the clearing like a crack of thunder. Pain exploded in my side as I crumpled to the ground, the world tilting sideways around me. I hadn't even had time to turn away. The shotgun pellets had torn through my left side, just below the ribs. I expected a second shot to finish the job, but it never came. Instead, I heard him laughing, a cold, emotionless sound that was somehow worse than the shotgun blast. He walked back to his truck, boots crunching on the gravel, the sound seeming absurdly loud in my shock-heightened senses. "Thanks for the smokes," he called back, his voice casual, as if we'd just concluded a pleasant business transaction. The Ford's engine roared to life, tires spinning in the dirt as he pulled away. The sound faded gradually until I was left in silence, broken only by my own ragged breathing and the soft patter of my blood soaking into the earth. I tried to assess the damage, hands fumbling at my side, coming away sticky and dark. The pain was unlike anything I'd ever experienced, a searing, white-hot agony that seemed to pulse with each heartbeat. I could feel wetness spreading across my shirt, warm at first, then cooling rapidly in the mountain air. "Help!" I tried to call out, but it emerged as little more than a whisper. There was no one to hear me anyway, just miles of indifferent forest in every direction. I needed to get to my truck, to the first aid kit, to the radio. 10 yards might as well have been 10 miles in my condition, but I began to drag myself across the ground, each movement sending fresh waves of agony through my body. The dirt beneath me turned dark with blood, leaving a macabre trail behind me. Night was falling rapidly now, the clearing dimming to murky twilight. The temperature dropped with the sun, and I began to shiver, from cold or shock, I couldn't tell which. Probably both. My thoughts became increasingly disjointed as blood loss took its toll. I thought about Randy, wondering if he was looking for me yet. About my sister in Oregon, who I hadn't spoken to in months because of some stupid argument I couldn't even remember. About my dog, Rusty, staying with a neighbor while I was on this run. Who would take care of him if I didn't make it back? Time lost all meaning as I lay there, drifting in and out of consciousness. The stars appeared, impossibly bright against the black sky, reminding me of all the nights I'd parked in remote places just to gaze up at them from my sleeping cab. The mountain air smelled of pine and my own blood, a coppery tang that seemed to grow stronger as the night wore on. At some point I became aware of eyes watching me from the tree line, pinpoints of reflected starlight that blinked and shifted position. Coyotes, maybe, or wolves, drawn by the scent of blood. They kept their distance for now, but they were patient. They could afford to wait. "Not yet," I whispered to them, to myself, to whatever might be listening. "Not like this." I don't know how long I lay there, bleeding and helpless. Time lost all meaning. I drifted in and out of consciousness, each return to awareness bringing fresh waves of pain and the realization that I was still alive, still fighting. During one of my lucid moments, I noticed a strange luminescence in the forest, pale blue lights that seemed to dance between the trees. I blinked, trying to clear my vision, but they remained, moving closer to the clearing with each passing moment. "Help!" I tried again, my voice a rasping whisper. The lights paused, hovering at the edge of the clearing. There seemed to be a pattern to their movement, almost deliberate, as if they were communicating with each other. I'd heard stories from other truckers about strange phenomena in remote mountain areas. Lights that lured travelers off roads, entities that were neither human nor animal. "Please," I managed, reaching a bloody hand toward them. The lights retreated slightly, then advanced again. I could almost make out shapes behind them, tall, slender silhouettes that moved with unnatural grace. My rational mind insisted they were hallucinations brought on by blood loss and trauma, but some deeper, more primitive part of me recognized them as something else entirely. Just as they reached the edge of the clearing, perhaps 20 yards from where I lay, headlights appeared on the forest road. Real, solid, unmistakably human headlights cutting through the darkness. The blue lights vanished instantly, retreating into the forest as if they'd never been. A truck pulled into the clearing, its headlights illuminating my prone form. The driver's door flew open, and a familiar figure emerged. "Jesus, Hank, what the hell happened?" Randy's voice, rough with panic, was the most beautiful sound I'd ever heard. "Guy, Ford, shotgun," I managed to gasp out, each word a monumental effort. Randy was at my side in an instant, his face pale with shock as he took in my condition. "Holy shit, you're bleeding bad. Hold on, buddy, just hold on." He ran back to his truck, returning with a first aid kit and his satellite phone. His hands moved with surprising gentleness for such a big man, applying pressure bandages to my wound, covering me with his jacket to ward off shock. "This is going to hurt," he warned, before pouring something that burned like liquid fire over the wound. I must have screamed, because the next thing I remember is his hand clamping over my mouth. "Shh," We don't know if he's still out here. Randy called for help, his voice terse, as he gave our coordinates from his GPS unit. Yes, gunshot wound. No, I don't know who. He's losing a lot of blood. Please hurry. He stayed with me, talking constantly to keep me conscious, alternating between reassurances and questions about what had happened. I told him everything I could remember, the detour, the clearing, the man with the shotgun. Did you see his face? Would you recognize him? Randy asked, his eyes constantly scanning the tree line as if expecting the shooter to return. Yes, I whispered. I'll never forget it. Within an hour, the whump-whump of helicopter blades cut through the night. A search and rescue team had been dispatched from Bozeman, alerted by Randy's call. Bright lights illuminated the clearing as they landed, transforming the nightmarish scene into something clinical and urgent. Paramedics swarmed around me, their voices a blur of medical terminology. IVs were inserted, monitors attached, my wound examined and temporarily treated. They loaded me onto a stretcher. Randy's face, the last thing I saw before they closed the helicopter doors. I'll meet you at the hospital, he called. Don't you dare die on me, Hank. As the helicopter lifted off, I caught one last glimpse of the clearing below, the dark stain of my blood on the ground, Randy's truck parked beside my abandoned rig, and just for a moment, what looked like pale blue lights at the forest edge, watching us depart. Then, the darkness took me completely, and I knew nothing more. I woke to the steady beep of a cardiac monitor and the antiseptic smell of hospital linens. The ceiling above me was acoustic tile, illuminated by harsh fluorescent lighting that made my eyes water. For a moment, I couldn't remember where I was or how I'd gotten there. Then the pain in my side brought it all crashing back. A nurse noticed I was awake and approached, checking the monitors before addressing me. Welcome back, Mr. Mercer. You're at Bozeman Deaconess Hospital. Do you remember what happened to you? Shot, I managed, my throat raw from intubation. In the woods. She nodded, adjusting something on my IV. The doctor will be in shortly. You're very lucky to be alive. Lucky wasn't exactly how I felt, but I understood her meaning. The shotgun blast had torn through muscle and tissue, but somehow missed vital organs. 6 inches higher or to the right, and I'd have been dead before Randy found me. The doctor arrived, a tired-looking woman in her 50s with short gray hair and glasses perched on her nose. Mr. Mercer, I'm Dr. Patel. You've been through quite an ordeal. She explained the extent of my injuries, multiple pellet wounds to the left side, significant blood loss, early-stage hypothermia, and shock. I'd been in surgery for 4 hours while they removed shotgun pellets and repaired damaged tissue. You'll have some impressive scars, she concluded, but with physical therapy and time, we expect a full recovery. The police are waiting to speak with you if you feel up to it. I nodded, wincing at the pain the movement caused. Send them in. 2 officers entered, a weathered state trooper named Dawson and a younger sheriff's deputy called Martinez. They pulled up chairs beside my bed, notebooks ready. Mr. Mercer, Trooper Dawson began, we need to get your statement about what happened out there. I told them everything I could remember, the detour, the clearing, the man with the shotgun. I described him in detail, mid-50s to early 60s, about 6 feet tall, lean but strong, gray-streaked beard, hollow cheeks, dead eyes. The Ford pickup, white once but now rusted and primer-patched. The casual way he'd shot me, as if he were putting down a wounded animal rather than murdering a human being. He took my wallet and phone, I added, but that wasn't why he did it. He was going to shoot me regardless. Martinez took detailed notes while Dawson asked clarifying questions. They showed me a series of mugshots, but none of them matched the man I'd seen. Forest Service Road 217 has been a problem area, Dawson admitted. There have been reports of missing hikers, vandalized vehicles, nothing like this though. Any other victims? I asked. The officers exchanged glances. Nothing confirmed, Martinez said carefully. But there are unsolved missing persons cases in the area. People who disappeared while traveling alone. They promised to increase patrols, to check the area thoroughly, to put out an APB on the truck and driver. But I could tell from their expressions that they didn't hold out much hope of finding him. The mountains were vast, the population sparse, and a man who knew the back roads could disappear like smoke. After they left, exhaustion claimed me again, and I drifted into uneasy sleep, filled with dreams of blue lights among the trees and a faceless figure raising a shotgun. The next time I woke, Randy was sitting beside my bed, his massive frame looking incongruous in the small hospital chair. His normally jovial face was creased with worry, but he managed to smile when he saw I was awake. "You look like hammered shit," he greeted me, reaching over to gently squeeze my shoulder. "Feel worse," I croaked. "Thanks for finding me." "Damn lucky I did," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "When you didn't show at our meetup spot, I tried your cell. Nothing. Called dispatch and they said you'd taken some forest road detour. Didn't sound right. You always stick to the main routes. So I backtracked, found where you'd turned off, and followed. I owed him my life, and we both knew it. In our line of work, we learn early on who we can count on. Randy had always been that person for me." "The police find anything?" I asked. He shook his head. "They're looking, but—" He trailed off, not needing to complete the thought. We both understood the odds. Randy stayed most of the day, leaving only to retrieve some clothes and personal items from my truck, which had been towed to a secure lot. He brought news from the outside world. My cargo had been transferred to another driver. My company was handling the insurance. My sister had been notified and was flying in the next day. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of pain medication, physical therapy sessions, and police interviews. They never found the man with the shotgun or my stolen wallet. My phone turned up in a ditch 20 miles from the clearing, smashed beyond repair. My sister arrived, bringing with her a wave of both comfort and tension. Catherine and I had always been close in our way, but we were as different as siblings could be. She, the settled academic with a husband and 2 kids in Portland, me, the nomadic trucker with no fixed address. Still, blood called to blood, and she stayed for a week, helping with my recovery and trying, in her way, to understand the life that had led me to that clearing. "You could come stay with us while you recover," she offered on her last day. "The guest room is yours as long as you need it." It was tempting. The thought of returning to the road filled me with a dread I'd never experienced before. But I knew myself well enough to recognize that hiding wouldn't heal what was broken inside me. "Thanks, Kat," I said, squeezing her hand, "but I need to get back on my own 2 feet. My own way." She looked disappointed, but not surprised. "Just promise me you'll be more careful. No more detours." "No more detours," I agreed. I stayed in the hospital for a week, recovering from the gunshot wound. Randy visited every day, bringing me news from the road and keeping my spirits up. My fellow truckers rallied around me in their way, sending messages, arranging for my dog to be cared for, even starting a collection to help with expenses not covered by insurance. The police investigation stalled. They found evidence that someone had been living in an abandoned hunting cabin near the clearing, empty food cans, cigarette butts, a makeshift bed. But whoever it was had cleared out, leaving no fingerprints or DNA. They did find 3 sets of bones. Deer, they said, though something about the way the trooper avoided my eyes when he told me made me wonder. Nightmares plagued me. The man with the shotgun, the blue lights in the forest, the feeling of my blood soaking into the earth. I'd wake gasping, the hospital room momentarily transformed into that clearing, the medical equipment becoming twisted trees closing in around me. The hospital psychiatrist diagnosed PTSD and prescribed medication, which I accepted but rarely took. The pills dulled everything, not just the fear, and I needed my edge if I was going to recover. When I finally got out, I took some time off to heal and think about what had happened. My company was understanding, putting me on medical leave with partial pay while I recovered. I rented a small apartment in Bozeman, unwilling to stray too far from the place where it had happened. I needed to face this thing, whatever it was, on its own ground. Physical therapy was grueling but effective. By the 3rd month, I could move without constant pain, though weather changes sent twinges through my scarred side. The deeper wounds, the ones no one could see, were slower to heal. I found myself jumping at sudden noises, scanning parking lots for white Ford pickups, sleeping with a loaded gun beside my bed. I avoided forests and isolated areas, preferring the anonymity of crowded streets and well-lit stores. Night terrors continued, though less frequently as time passed. But the strangest aftermath was my obsession with the blue lights I'd seen in the forest. In my more rational moments, I dismissed them as hallucinations brought on by blood loss and trauma. But late at night, when sleep eluded me, I found myself researching similar phenomena reported in mountain regions across the country. I discovered accounts from hikers, hunters, and other truckers who described seeing similar lights in remote areas, dancing blue orbs that seemed to move with purpose, sometimes leading travelers deeper into wilderness, sometimes watching from a distance. Native American legends spoke of spirit lights that appeared to those close to death. Scientists dismissed them as swamp gas or electrical phenomena. Whatever they were, I couldn't shake the feeling that they had been coming for me before Randy arrived, and I wasn't sure if their intentions had been to help or to claim. 4 months after the shooting, the police called with news. They'd found my wallet in a pawn shop 200 miles away in Idaho. The man who'd pawned it matched the description I'd given, but he'd used a fake ID and disappeared before they could apprehend him. It wasn't much, but it confirmed what I already knew. He was still out there somewhere. As my body healed, I began to contemplate returning to the road. Not out of desire, but necessity. Trucking was the only life I knew, and my savings wouldn't last forever. The question wasn't if I would drive again, but how I would face the fear that now lived permanently in my gut. 6 months to the day after I was shot, I climbed back into the cab of my Peterbilt. The company had kept it for me, understanding the bond between a driver and his rig. It had been detailed and serviced. The seat adjusted to accommodate my still tender side, a new satellite radio installed as a welcome-back gift. My first run would be simple, a straight shot from Bozeman to Billings on I-90, hauling agricultural equipment. No detours, no forest roads, no isolated stops. Randy had arranged to make the same run, riding tandem with me the whole way. "Just like riding a bike," he said over the CB as we pulled out of the depot. "Except the bike weighs 40 tons and could flatten a Volkswagen." I managed to laugh, but my hands were slick with sweat on the wheel. Every curve in the road, every passing pickup truck sent my heart rate spiking. By the time we reached Livingston, my shirt was soaked through and my jaw ached from clenching. We stopped at our usual diner, though it took Randy some convincing to get me inside. I kept my back to the wall, eyes constantly moving to the door, barely tasting the food I mechanically consumed. "It gets easier," Randy said quietly. My first run after Iraq was the same. Thought every piece of trash on the road was an IED. I hadn't known he'd served. In all our years of friendship, he'd never mentioned it. That was the way with road friendships. Sometimes you knew a man's deepest fears before you knew his history. "How'd you get past it?" I asked. He considered the question, stirring his coffee thoughtfully. "Never really did, completely. Just learned to live alongside it. The fear becomes like a passenger, always there. But you decide if it gets to drive." Simple wisdom, but it helped. By the time we reached Billings, I'd settled into a rhythm. Not comfortable yet, but functional. We delivered our loads, spent the night at a modem near the depot, and headed back the next day. Over the following weeks, I gradually increased my range and complexity of runs. Bozeman to Missoula, Missoula to Spokane. Eventually, a long haul to Minneapolis, the run I'd been on when everything went sideways. I still kept to the main roads, avoided driving after dark when possible, and carried a licensed firearm in my cab. I'd given up cigarettes, couldn't stand the smell of them anymore, the association too strong with the man who'd shot me. I still had nightmares, but they were less frequent, less vivid. What I couldn't shake was the feeling of being watched. Sometimes on empty stretches of highway, I'd catch glimpses of movement in my mirrors. Never anything concrete, just impressions of something pacing my truck. At night in rest stops, I'd wake to what sounded like footsteps circling my rig, though security cameras never showed anyone. And then there were the lights. I'd spot them occasionally, blue luminescence hovering at the tree line along remote stretches of road. Never close enough to make out details, always gone when I looked directly at them. I told myself they were reflections, fireflies, electrical anomalies, anything but what my gut told me they were. 3 months into my return to driving, I was making a run through eastern Montana when a familiar voice crackled over my CB. "Breaker 19 for that Blue Thunder. You got your ears on, Hank?" I hadn't heard that voice in nearly a year, but I recognized it instantly. The same gravelly rasp that had told me to empty my pockets before shooting me and leaving me for dead. My blood turned to ice water in my veins. I snatched up the handset, thoughts racing. Should I respond, ignore it, call the police? "I know you're listening, truck driver," the voice continued. "Been watching you a long time now. You're a hard man to kill." My hand trembled as I pressed the transmit button. "What do you want?" A chuckle crackled through the speaker. "Just to say hello, and that I'll be seeing you again sooner or later. Maybe next time those pretty blue lights won't be interrupted. I pulled over, scanning the highway behind and ahead of me, searching for the white Ford pickup. Nothing but empty roads stretched in both directions, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the asphalt. "Where are you?" I demanded into the CB. "Closer than you think. Always closer than you think." The transmission ended with a burst of static. I tried to call him back, but there was no response, just silence and the distant rumble of highway traffic. I called the police, reported the communication, gave them my location. They sent a patrol car, took my statement, promised to look into it, but we all knew it was futile. CB transmissions were virtually untraceable, and without knowing where he was broadcasting from, they had nothing to go on. That night, parked at a busy truck stop with security cameras and plenty of witnesses around, I finally pulled out the journal I'd been keeping since the shooting. In it, I'd documented everything: the attack, the recovery, the nightmares, the blue lights, and now this new contact. Looking over my entries, a pattern emerged that I hadn't noticed before. The sightings of blue lights, the feelings of being watched, they always seemed to occur near the anniversary of the shooting or when I was passing through certain areas of Montana. Whatever this was, whether a deranged hunter who got his kicks from targeting truckers or something more inexplicable tied to those blue lights in the forest, it wasn't over. Maybe it would never be over. I still drive trucks, but I'm more cautious now. I stick to the main roads, avoid detours, and I always keep a gun in the cab. The open road doesn't feel quite as free as it used to, but it's still my livelihood, my life. That night in Montana changed me. It reminded me that no matter how much we think we're in control, there's always an element of unpredictability out there, and sometimes that unpredictability comes with a shotgun and a cold, calculating stare. I never found out who that man was or why he targeted me. Maybe it was random, or maybe he had a reason I'll never understand. But one thing's for sure. I'll never forget the fear and helplessness I felt in that clearing, and I'll never take the safety of the open road for granted again. Life goes on, and so does the road. But every time I pass a beat-up old Ford, I can't help but wonder if it's him, watching, waiting. And I grip the wheel a little tighter, knowing that out there in the vast expanse of America, danger can find you when you least expect it. And sometimes when I'm driving through the mountains at dusk, I catch glimpses of blue lights among the trees, keeping pace with my truck. I don't know if they're harbingers of death or some kind of protection. All I know is that they're watching, always watching, and someday I might find out why. Until then, I keep driving. Because that's what truckers do. We keep moving forward, no matter what darkness waits around the next bend.